5 women ran from him. 5 times, Gideon Voss watched hope disappear down that mountain trail, leaving nothing but tracks in the snow and the bitter confirmation that some men are simply too broken to be loved. The 6th woman who climbed toward his cabin wasn't supposed to be different. She was just supposed to be the last attempt before he accepted his fate. But when Eleanor Pike arrived with a worn traveling bag and eyes that had seen their own share of rejection, something impossible began to happen on that frozen Montana peak. This is the story of 2 people the world had given up on, who refused to give up on each other. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The trap had frozen shut again. Gideon Voss knelt in 2 feet of snow, his massive hands working the steel jaws that had seized up overnight. February in the Montana high country didn't care about a man's schedule or his need to check his lines before the wolves did. The metal finally gave way with a crack that echoed across the silent valley, and Gideon reset the mechanism with practiced efficiency, his breath forming clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. He was a big man, not just tall, but built like the mountain itself had carved him from granite and forgotten to smooth the edges. 6'4", broad-shouldered, with hands that could snap a deer's neck as easily as they could whittle a chess piece from pine. A scar ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, a gift from a territorial grizzly 3 winters back. His beard, more gray than brown now despite his 41 years, couldn't quite hide the other scars, the smaller ones that came from a lifetime of surviving places that killed softer men. The sun was starting to break over the eastern ridge when Gideon finished his line. 11 traps, 4 with beaver, 2 with marten. Good haul. He loaded the frozen carcasses onto his packboard, the weight settling familiar across his shoulders, and began the 2-mile trek back to the cabin. His cabin. His kingdom of solitude. His prison. It sat in a clearing he'd carved from the wilderness 7 years ago, after he'd finally saved enough from his trapping to stop living like a nomad. Solid log construction, chinked against the wind, with a stone chimney that drew smoke clean, and a roof that had survived every storm the mountain threw at it. 20 feet by 16, with a sleeping loft and a root cellar he'd dug by hand through frozen ground. It was good work, honest work. It was also the loneliest place Gideon had ever known. He pushed through this door, never locked, because who the hell was going to rob a trapper's cabin 8 miles from the nearest settlement, and dropped his pack by the skinning bench. The interior was exactly as he'd left it 12 hours ago. Clean, organized, and completely devoid of anything that suggested a human being lived there rather than just survived there. The stove in the corner held the remnants of last night's fire. Gideon fed it kindling and birch bark, coaxing it back to life, then filled his coffee pot with snow melted in the reservoir. While the water heated, he skinned out the beaver with quick, precise cuts. The pelts would fetch decent money at Morrison's trading post, assuming he could stand another encounter with the pitying looks and careful questions. Any word from that last lady, Gideon? She make it up the mountain, all right. Shame about the other one. Real shame. Gideon drained his coffee, black, strong enough to strip paint, and stared at the empty chair across from his rough-hewn table. He'd built 2 chairs, bought 2 tin cups, made space in the loft for someone else's things. 5 times he'd made that space. 5 times it had gone unused. The first woman had been Martha Hendricks, a widow from Ohio with 2 young children. Gideon had spent 3 months writing careful letters, describing his land, his prospects, his desire for a family. She'd written back with increasing warmth, and when she'd finally agreed to come west, he'd felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: hope. He'd cleaned the cabin until his hands bled, built a second room for the children, carved toys from cedar. Martha had taken one look at him standing on the platform at Granite Falls Station, and her face had gone pale. She'd stayed 2 days in town before taking the next stage back east. She never even made it to the mountain. The second woman, Caroline, had at least attempted the journey. She'd made it as far as Morrison's trading post before the reality of the isolation hit her. "I can't," she'd told him, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I could, but I can't. There's nothing here. Nothing but trees and silence and—" She hadn't finished. Hadn't needed to. The "and you" had hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Ruth came next. She'd lasted 4 days in the cabin before the mountain broke her. Not fear of Gideon, she'd been kind about that at least. But the wilderness itself had crushed her spirit. The walls of trees, the absolute darkness when the sun set, the sounds of animals she couldn't identify. On the fourth night, she'd woken screaming from a nightmare about being buried alive, and by morning she was packed and gone. Sarah had been different, practical, sturdy, with a farmer's daughter's understanding of hard work and isolation. Gideon had actually believed it might work. They'd spent 3 weeks together, falling into an easy routine of chores and meals and evening conversations. Then a late spring storm had buried the mountain under 4 feet of snow, cutting them off completely for 6 days. When the trail finally cleared, Sarah left without a word of explanation. Just a note on the table. "I'm sorry. I tried." The fifth woman had never arrived at all. Elizabeth Morris had written the most beautiful letters Gideon had ever received. Thoughtful, funny, full of observations about birds and weather and the books she was reading. He'd read those letters so many times the creases had started to tear. When she'd written to say she was coming, he'd believed, truly believed, that this time would be different. He'd ridden down to meet her stage, wearing his cleanest clothes, his beard trimmed, his hair as tame as he could make it. He'd even practiced what to say, whispering greetings to himself like a damn fool as he waited at the station. Elizabeth had stepped off the stage, looked directly at him, and frozen. Gideon had seen the recognition in her eyes. She knew who he was, had been expecting him. But what followed wasn't recognition. It was something worse, something that looked like horror poorly disguised as disappointment. She'd approached slowly, like someone walking toward a dangerous animal. "Mr. Voss?" "Miss Morris." He'd removed his hat, tried to smile. "It's good to finally meet you." She'd nodded, but her hands were trembling. I'm not feeling well. The journey was difficult. I think I need to rest in town for a few days before—" Of course. He'd heard the lie, but couldn't bring himself to challenge it. "I'll be at Morrison's post when you're ready. Take your time." He'd waited 4 days. On the 5th, the station master handed him a letter. Elizabeth had taken the next stage east. She apologized for wasting his time. She hoped he'd understand. She wished him well. Gideon had ridden back up the mountain in silence, the letter crumpled in his coat pocket, and he'd made himself a promise. No more. That had been 8 months ago. 8 months of silence broken only by wind, wildlife, and his own voice when he forgot and spoke aloud out of habit. 8 months of eating meals he couldn't taste, sleeping in a bed that felt too big, working until exhaustion was the only thing that could quiet his mind. The world had made its judgment clear. Gideon Voss was too much. Too big, too rough, too scarred, too isolated, too everything that decent women avoided. He could provide safety and comfort and unwavering loyalty, but none of that mattered when the sight of him made women's hands shake with barely concealed fear. He finished skinning the morning's catch and stretched the pelts on frames to dry. The morning sun was climbing toward noon, which meant he had fence repairs to finish before the next snow. The north pasture needed reinforcing. He'd lost 2 sections to a fallen tree last week, and the shed roof was developing a leak that would turn into a disaster if he didn't patch it soon. Work. Always more work. That's what his life had become. An endless series of tasks performed in solitude, punctuated by trips to town where people were kind but distant, sympathetic but relieved to see him leave. Gideon pulled on his heavy coat and headed for the door. His hand was on the latch when he heard it. The distant sound of approaching horses. He froze, listening. 2 animals, maybe 3, moving at a walk up the trail from town. Nobody came up here without reason, and there were damn few good reasons to visit Gideon Voss. He stepped onto the porch, hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept by the door. The riders emerged from the tree line a minute later, Jack Morrison from the trading post on his gray mare, accompanied by young Tommy Chen, the half-Chinese kid who worked deliveries. They were leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. "Gideon!" Morrison called out, raising a hand in greeting. He was a thick man in his 50s, with a trader's friendly face and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Got a delivery for you." Gideon descended the porch steps, confused. "Didn't order anything." "Well, someone did." Morrison swung down from his saddle with a grunt. Tommy stayed mounted, looking uncomfortable. The kid had always been nervous around Gideon, though he tried to hide it. Morrison reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. "This came on yesterday's stage. Addressed to you, care of my post." Gideon took the package slowly. It was light, felt like paper. "Who's it from?" Return address says Kansas. Woman's handwriting, looks like. Morrison's face was carefully neutral, but Gideon could read the pity there. Everyone in town knew about the 5 women, about the lonely mountain man who couldn't keep a wife. Could have held it at the post, Gideon said quietly. Could have, but the note that came with it said it was urgent. Figured I'd save you the trip down. Morrison glanced at the cabin, then back at Gideon. You doing all right up here? Haven't seen you in town for near 2 months. Been busy. Trapping's been good. That's good. That's real good. Morrison shifted his weight, clearly wanting to say more but not sure how. Listen, Gideon, I know things haven't, with the ladies and all. He trailed off, then tried again. What I'm saying is, you got friends in town. You know that, right? You're not alone. Gideon looked at the kind, pitying face and felt something cold settle in his chest. This was his future. Well-meaning people treating him like a wounded animal. Careful kindness masking the relief they felt that they weren't him. I know, he said. Thanks for bringing this up. Morrison nodded, clearly relieved to escape the awkward conversation. Right, well, we'll let you get on with your day. He mounted up, Tommy already turning his horse. You need anything, you know where to find me. They disappeared back down the trail, leaving Gideon standing in the snow with the mysterious package. He stared at it for a long moment, then carried it inside and set it on the table. A package from Kansas. A woman's handwriting. He should burn it. Whatever fresh disappointment waited inside that brown paper, he didn't need it. He'd made peace with his solitude, accepted it. This cabin would be his world until the day he died. And that was fine. It was enough. It had to be enough. Gideon made himself walk away. He forced himself through the afternoon's chores, repaired the fence, patched the shed roof, split enough wood to last through the next storm. The package sat on the table the entire time, visible through the cabin window whenever he passed. Waiting. Darkness came early this time of year. By 4 o'clock, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple that turned the snow-covered peaks into something from a painting. Gideon had seen that sunset 1,000 times, but tonight it looked different somehow. More vivid. Or maybe he was just tired. He made dinner, venison stew with the last of his potatoes and carrots from the root cellar, and sat down at the table. The package sat across from him, exactly where a person would sit if there were anyone else here. Gideon ate slowly, then slower, until finally he pushed his bowl aside and picked up the package with hands that weren't quite steady. The return address read E. Pike, Lawrence, Kansas. E. Pike. He didn't know anyone in Kansas, hadn't written to anyone there. Whatever this was, it wasn't a response to any letter he'd sent. He cut the string with his knife and unwrapped the paper carefully. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written in neat but unfancy handwriting. The paper was good quality but not expensive. Practical. He unfolded the first page and began to read. Dear Mr. Voss, you don't know me, and I apologize for the presumption of writing to you without introduction or invitation. My name is Eleanor Pike. I am 38 years old, unmarried, and currently living in Lawrence, Kansas, where I work as a seamstress and sometimes help my brother with his small dry goods store. I heard about you from my cousin, who heard about you from a woman named Elizabeth Morris. I understand Miss Morris was supposed to marry you but changed her mind. I also understand this wasn't the first time such a thing has happened to you. Gideon stopped reading. His hands had tightened on the paper, crumpling the edges. So this was it. Another curious stranger wanting to hear about the mountain hermit who couldn't find a wife. Another person drawn to his humiliation like spectators to an accident. He almost threw the letter in the fire. Almost. But something made him keep reading. I'm not writing to pity you or to satisfy my own curiosity about your situation. I'm writing because Miss Morris described you as too frightening and impossibly isolated, and I thought to myself that I've heard those exact words before, except they were being said about me. I am not a beautiful woman. I'm not graceful or charming or any of the things men typically want. I'm tall, 5'9", and built strong from years of physical work. I have a loud voice and opinions I don't apologize for. I laugh too hard at jokes that aren't funny, and I argue with people who say stupid things, which is apparently behavior unbecoming of a lady. I've had 3 engagements in my life. All 3 men broke it off. The first said I was too masculine. The second said I made him feel small. The third didn't give a reason, just stopped calling one day and married someone quieter within the year. I don't tell you this to earn sympathy. I'm telling you because I think we might understand each other in a way that most people couldn't. The world has decided we don't fit, Mr. Voss. We're too much of something or not enough of something else, and that's supposed to be the end of our story. But I'm wondering if maybe it doesn't have to be. Gideon read the last line 3 times. His heart was doing something strange in his chest, beating too hard, too fast. He forced himself to continue. I'm not proposing marriage. I'm not proposing anything, really, except honesty. If you're willing, I'd like to write to you. Real letters, not the kind where we pretend to be softer or smaller or easier than we actually are. Letters where we tell the truth about who we are and what we want, without apology. If you're not interested, that's fine. Burn this letter and forget about it. But if you are interested, if you're tired of being alone and tired of pretending it doesn't matter, write back. Tell me about your mountain. Tell me what happened with those 5 women. Tell me the truth. I'll do the same. Respectfully, Eleanor Pike. P.S. I enclosed a photograph. It's not a good one. I don't photograph well. But I figured you should know what you'd be corresponding with. Fair warning, I look exactly as unmarriageable as advertised. Gideon set down the letter with hands that had started shaking. There was indeed a photograph, a small carte de visite that had slipped from between the pages. He picked it up carefully. The woman staring back at him was exactly what she'd described. Not beautiful in any conventional sense. She was broad-shouldered and square-jawed, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes were direct, meeting the camera without any attempt at the soft, demure expression women were supposed to affect. She wore a plain, dark dress that looked handmade, sturdy rather than fashionable. She looked capable, real, like someone who'd never pretended to be anything other than exactly what she was. Gideon studied the photograph for a long time, then read the letter again. And again, looking for the trap, the joke, the hidden cruelty. But there was none. Just blunt honesty delivered without decoration. We're too much of something, or not enough of something else. He knew that feeling, had lived with it his entire life. Too big, too rough, too quiet, too intense. Never quite fitting anywhere, always aware that his presence made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate. The 5 women who'd left him hadn't been wrong to leave. He understood that. This life, this mountain, this isolation, this version of existence wasn't for everyone. Most people needed civilization, community, the comfort of knowing their neighbors and seeing familiar faces. There was nothing wrong with that, but there was also nothing wrong with him. That thought hit Gideon like a physical blow. For the first time in 8 months, maybe in his entire life, he considered the possibility that he wasn't broken. That maybe, just maybe, he'd simply been trying to fit into a space that was never meant to hold him. He looked at Eleanor Pike's photograph again, at her direct gaze and unapologetic expression, at the strength in her shoulders and the defiance in the set of her jaw. If you're tired of being alone and tired of pretending it doesn't matter, write back. Gideon stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He crossed to the small writing desk in the corner, another piece of furniture that saw little use, and pulled out paper and ink. His hand hovered over the blank page for several long moments. Then he began to write. Dear Miss Pike, your letter arrived today. I read it 4 times. I'm still not entirely sure what to make of it, but I'm writing back, which I suppose tells you something. You asked for honesty, so here it is. You're right. 5 women left me. 3 before they even got to the mountain, 2 after seeing what life here actually means. I don't blame any of them. This place isn't easy, and I'm not easy, and combining those 2 facts makes for a situation most people would run from. I'm big enough to scare children when I come to town. I have scars from fights with animals and weather and the mountain itself. I go weeks without talking to another human being, and when I do talk, I've forgotten how to make the kind of small conversation people expect. I'm blunt when I should be gentle and silent when I should speak up, and apparently that's enough to make me unmarriageable. I've made peace with that. Or I thought I had, until your letter arrived and made me reconsider whether peace and resignation are the same thing. Gideon paused, reading what he'd written. It felt raw, exposed in a way that made him uncomfortable. But Eleanor had asked for truth, and if he couldn't offer that, what was the point? He kept writing. You asked what happened with the 5 women. The short version is they couldn't handle the isolation. The longer version is more complicated. The first woman never made it past the train station, took one look at me and decided I wasn't what she'd imagined. The second made it to town, but not the mountain. The third lasted 4 days before the silence broke her. The fourth seemed fine until a storm trapped us for almost a week, and something about that pushed her past her limits. The fifth changed her mind before even meeting me. What they all had in common was this. They looked at my life and saw a prison. They looked at me and saw someone who'd chosen this prison, which made me either crazy or dangerous or both. But here's the thing, Miss Pike. I didn't choose this life because I hate people or because I'm hiding from the world. I chose it because up here, I finally fit. The mountain doesn't care that I'm too big or too quiet or too rough. The wilderness doesn't judge me for not knowing how to make polite conversation. Up here, I can be exactly what I am, without apology. That's what those 5 women couldn't understand. They thought I was isolated. I think I was finally free. He stopped again, surprised by his own words. He'd never articulated that before, not even to himself. But it was true. For all its loneliness, the mountain had given him something civilization never could. Permission to exist without constantly shrinking himself to fit other people's comfort. You said you're tall and strong and loud and opinionated, and you describe those things like they're flaws. They're not, or they shouldn't be. But I understand why you think they are. The world doesn't like women who take up space any more than it likes men who take up too much of it. So, yes, I'll write to you. Real letters, honest ones, without pretending to be something I'm not. You should know what you're getting into, though. I'm not looking for a pen pal or a distant friend. If we're going to do this, I need to know it might lead somewhere. I can't spend another year writing careful letters to someone who will eventually decide I'm too much to handle. If that's too direct, I apologize. But you asked for honesty, and that's the most honest thing I can tell you. I'm tired of being alone. I'm tired of pretending it doesn't matter. And I'm tired of changing myself to fit a world that will never accept me anyway. If you're still interested after reading this, write back. Tell me about Kansas. Tell me about the 3 men who were stupid enough to let you go. Tell me the truth. Gideon Voss. P.S. I don't have a photograph to send you. I don't own a camera, and I avoid photographers when I'm in town. But if you're picturing someone large, scarred, and rough around every edge, you're probably close enough. He read the letter through twice, then sealed it before he could talk himself out of sending it. The next morning, he made the 8-mile ride down to Morrison's post and handed over the letter without explanation. Morrison looked at the Kansas address and raised his eyebrows but didn't comment. This going out on today's stage? Yeah. All right then. Morrison pocketed the letter, then studied Gideon's face. You look different somehow. Something happened. Gideon considered the question. Had something happened? He wasn't sure. All he'd done was write a letter to a stranger who probably wouldn't write back. That wasn't change. That wasn't hope. It was just possibility. The smallest crack in the wall he'd built around his expectations. No, he said finally. Nothing happened. But as he rode back up the mountain, the lie sat heavy in his chest. Something had happened. Something had shifted. He just didn't know what yet. The days that followed were an exercise in forced normalcy. Gideon ran his trap lines, repaired equipment, stocked firewood against the next storm. He did everything exactly as he'd done for 8 months, with one crucial difference. Now he was listening for hoofbeats on the trail. A letter from Kansas to Montana would take at least 2 weeks, probably longer. Gideon knew this. He'd calculated it carefully, marking the days on the calendar he kept by his bed. 2 weeks minimum for his letter to arrive. A few days for her to respond, if she responded at all. 2 weeks for her reply to reach him. 4 weeks total. Maybe 5. Maybe never. He made it 3 weeks before he cracked and rode down to Morrison's post on the flimsiest of pretexts. He needed salt, he told himself, and coffee, though both were lies. He needed to know if there was a letter. There wasn't. Morrison saw the disappointment Gideon couldn't quite hide and pretended not to notice. Nothing came for you today, but the stage was light. Weather probably slowed things down. Check back in a few days. Gideon rode home in silence, angry at himself for hoping, angrier still for letting that hope show. But 4 days later, when Morrison sent Tommy Chen up the mountain with a package marked urgent, perishable contents, Gideon's hand shook so badly he could barely unwrap it. Inside was a letter and a small tin of cookies. He read the letter first. Dear Mr. Voss, your letter arrived this morning, and I'll confess I read it 3 times before I believed you'd actually responded. Most men, when confronted with a woman describing herself as unmarriageable, tend to either make polite excuses or launch into patronizing reassurances about how I'm not that bad and just need to soften my approach. You did neither. Thank you for that. You asked about Kansas. It's flat, Mr. Voss. Relentlessly, oppressively flat. You can see for miles in every direction, which sounds liberating until you realize it means there's nowhere to hide from neighbors' judgment or summer heat or winter wind. The sky here is bigger than it has any right to be, and storms blow in like freight trains. I don't hate it exactly, but I've never loved it either. I've never felt the way you describe feeling about your mountain, like the place itself gave you permission to exist. Kansas has only ever felt like somewhere I ended up, not somewhere I chose. You asked about the 3 engagements. Here's the truth. The first man, Daniel Hartley, proposed when I was 23. He was a school teacher, soft-spoken and kind, and I thought we understood each other. We were engaged for 4 months before his mother took me aside at a church social and explained very gently that I would need to learn to be less present if I wanted to be a suitable wife for her son. When I asked what that meant, she said I spoke too loudly, laughed too freely, and had opinions on subjects that weren't appropriate for women to discuss. I told her I'd rather die alone than spend my life making myself smaller. Daniel broke the engagement a week later, said we weren't compatible after all. The second man, Robert Chen, yes, Chinese father, white mother, which made him nearly as unmarriageable as me, lasted almost a year. We worked well together. He helped me with heavy lifting at the shop. I helped him with bookkeeping for his father's restaurant. Everyone said we made sense together, 2 outcasts finding each other. Maybe that was the problem. He didn't love me. He loved the idea of not being alone. When a prettier girl showed interest in him, someone delicate and proper, he left without a backwards glance. The third engagement I don't talk about. It ended badly and taught me that some men propose marriage when what they really want is ownership. I'll tell you about it someday, maybe, but not yet. You said you need to know this might lead somewhere, and I appreciate that clarity. Here's mine. I'm not writing to you for entertainment or curiosity. I'm 38 years old, Mr. Voss. I don't have time to waste on correspondence that goes nowhere. If we're going to do this, we should both understand what this means. I'm looking for a life that fits me. A place where being strong and loud and opinionated isn't something I have to apologize for. You described your mountain as permission to exist without constantly shrinking yourself. That's what I'm looking for too. The cookies are ginger snaps. I don't know if you like sweets, but baking helps me think, and I had a lot to think about after reading your letter. If they survived the journey without turning to crumbs, consider it a small miracle. Write back. Tell me about a typical day on your mountain. I want to know what life there actually looks like, not some romanticized version. Eleanor Gideon set down the letter and looked at the tin of cookies. They had survived mostly intact, only a few broken pieces rattling at the bottom. He ate one, standing in his kitchen, the spicy sweet flavor so unexpected after months of his own plain cooking that he had to sit down. They were perfect. Not fancy or delicate, just solid and good and exactly what they were supposed to be. He wrote back that night. Over the next 3 months, letters traveled between Montana and Kansas with increasing frequency. Gideon found himself writing down to Morrison's post twice a week, then 3 times, checking for Eleanor's responses. Morrison stopped commenting on it, though Gideon caught him smiling once when he handed over a particularly thick envelope. Eleanor wrote about her life in Lawrence with unflinching honesty. Her brother's store was struggling. Her seamstress work was steady but monotonous. She had 2 friends in town, both women who'd also been passed over by marriage for various reasons. One was too smart, the other too old. They met Tuesday evenings to play cards and complain about men. Gideon wrote about the mountain with equal honesty. He told her about the grizzly that had given him his face scar, about the week he'd spent snowbound with a broken leg and thought he might die, about the strange beauty of dawn at 10,000 feet when the world below was still dark. He told her about the loneliness that sometimes hit so hard he'd talk to his horse just to hear a voice respond. Their letters grew longer, more detailed. Eleanor asked questions about trapping techniques, and he answered with careful diagrams. He asked about her sewing, and she sent him a handkerchief she'd embroidered with a pine tree, slightly crooked but unmistakably made with care. Spring arrived on the mountain in fits and starts, snow melting into mud that froze again each night. Gideon's trap lines became less productive as animals emerged from winter dens, and he turned his attention to planting a larger garden than he'd bothered with in years. He found himself thinking about what Eleanor might like to grow, what she might need if she were here. If. That word hung over everything now. In early May, Eleanor's letter arrived with a different tone. Gideon knew something had changed before he even opened it. The paper was heavier, the envelope thicker. Dear Gideon, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to think carefully before answering. Don't respond immediately. Take time. Consider what you're saying. Would you be willing to marry me? Not now, not immediately, but eventually. After we've met. After we've spent enough time together to be certain this isn't a mistake. I'm asking if you'd be open to the possibility. Here's why I'm asking. My brother is selling the store. His wife is sick, and they're moving to Colorado for her health. Without the store work, I'll need to find new employment, and the prospects in Lawrence aren't good. I could move to another city, find another seamstress position, continue exactly as I have been. But I'm tired, Gideon. I'm tired of fighting for scraps in a world that doesn't want me. Your mountain sounds like permission to exist. I want that. I want a place where being strong is an asset instead of a flaw. Where silence is comfortable instead of awkward. Where I don't have to shrink myself to fit someone else's idea of what a woman should be. But I won't come to Montana as some desperate woman with nowhere else to go. I won't be the sixth woman who runs when reality doesn't match expectation. If I come, it's because we both believe this could work. Because we've been honest enough with each other to know what we're getting into. So here's my proposal. I'll come to Montana in July. I'll stay through the summer and into fall. We'll see if we can actually stand each other in person, if the life you've described is one I can build with you. If it works, we get married before winter. If it doesn't, I leave with no hard feelings and you never have to think about me again. 3 months. That's what I'm asking for. 3 months to find out if two people the world rejected can build something worth keeping. What do you say? Eleanor Gideon read the letter 5 times, then walked outside into the cool evening air. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the snow-covered summits in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere in the valley below, a hawk called. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. This was his place, his mountain, his solitude. And Eleanor Pike was asking if there might be room for her in it. The smart answer was no. He'd been through this 5 times before. 5 times he'd believed it might work, and 5 times he'd been wrong. Why would this be different? Because they'd written letters? Because she claimed to be strong enough to handle isolation? Ruth had claimed that too. Sarah had seemed certain. They'd all believed they could do it until the mountain proved them wrong. But none of them had been Eleanor. Gideon went back inside and lit the lamp on his writing desk. He pulled out fresh paper and stared at it for a long time before he began to write. Eleanor. Yes, I thought about saying more, about listing all the reasons this might not work or warning you again about how hard life here is. But you know all that. You've heard it from me a dozen times in a dozen letters. Adding more warnings now would just be me trying to protect myself from disappointment. So, yes, come in July. Stay through fall. We'll figure out if this can work. But I need you to understand something. If you come here and decide to leave, I won't be writing any more letters after that. I can't do this again. I can't spend another year hoping and then watching hope walk away. This is my last attempt. I'm not saying that to pressure you. I'm saying it because you deserve to know what you're walking into. This isn't a trial run with an easy exit. This is me offering you everything I have and asking you to decide if it's enough. Come in July. I'll meet you at Morrison's Post. We'll take it from there. Gideon. He sent the letter before he could reconsider. Then he spent the next 6 weeks in a state of controlled panic, preparing the cabin for Eleanor's arrival with the same intensity he'd brought to preparing for the 5 women before her. He built a privacy screen for the bedroom area, constructed a proper washstand with a mirror, repaired every squeaky floorboard and loose door hinge, whitewashed the interior walls and sewed curtains from fabric he bought in town, his thick fingers struggling with the delicate work. Morrison noticed the purchases and the unusual number of trips down the mountain, but said nothing until Gideon bought a set of good china dishes to replace his battered tin plates. She's really coming then? Morrison asked, wrapping the dishes carefully. July 15th. You nervous? Gideon looked at the trader for a long moment. terrified. Morrison nodded like this was the most reasonable thing in the world. Well, hope it works out this time. Really do. June passed in a blur of preparation and second-guessing. Gideon cleaned things that were already clean, fixed things that weren't broken, and lay awake at night trying to imagine what it would be like to have another person in his space after so many months alone. He'd forgotten how to share space with someone, how to moderate his movements in a small cabin so he didn't overwhelm it with his size, how to make conversation that wasn't just functional communication about tasks and weather. What if Eleanor took one look at him and realized the man in her imagination was nothing like the reality? What if the mountain that sounded romantic in letters felt like a prison in person? What if the silence he loved drove her slowly mad? What if this was another mistake in a long line of mistakes? July arrived with unusual heat, the snow line retreating up the mountain and wildflowers exploding across the meadows. On the morning of the 15th, Gideon rode down to Morrison's post 3 hours early, too anxious to wait any longer. The stage was due at noon. By 11:30, a small crowd had gathered. Morrison, Tommy Chen, a few trappers who'd come down from the high country to trade furs, and Mrs. Abernathy, who ran the boarding house and never missed the stage's arrival. They all knew why Gideon was there. They'd all seen him wait before. At 12:15, the stage rattled into view, the driver cursing at his team as they navigated the muddy road. It lurched to a stop in front of Morrison's porch, and the driver climbed down to open the passenger door. 3 people emerged. A salesman Gideon vaguely recognized, an elderly couple heading to see family in the mountains, and a tall woman in a practical traveling dress carrying a worn leather bag. Eleanor Pike looked exactly like her photograph, and nothing like it at all. The image had captured her features but missed everything else. The way she moved with complete confidence despite the attention of every person in the small crowd. The directness of her gaze as she scanned faces looking for his. The set of her shoulders that suggested she was ready for whatever came next. Her eyes found Gideon and stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Eleanor crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides and stuck out her hand like she was meeting a business partner. "Mr. Voss?" "Miss Pike." Gideon took her hand carefully, aware of every eye watching them. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused from work. She was exactly as tall as she'd claimed, which put the top of her head level with his shoulder. "How was your journey?" "Long, hot. The last leg from Kansas City had a wheel that squeaked for 200 miles. Eleanor released his hand and turned to survey the settlement, a handful of buildings clustered around Morrison's trading post, with mountains rising in every direction. "This is the town?" "This is it. My cabin's 8 miles up the mountain." 8 miles. Eleanor looked at the trail that disappeared into the pine forest, then back at Gideon. "On horseback?" "Unless you'd prefer to walk." Something that might have been amusement crossed her face. "I'd prefer not to collapse from exhaustion on my first day." "Horseback is fine." Morrison approached, clearly trying not to stare. "Miss Pike?" "Jack Morrison. I run the trading post. If you need anything during your stay, you just let me know." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison." Eleanor's smile was polite but distant. She wasn't here to make friends with the locals. She was here for Gideon. The realization sent something warm through his chest. "I've got a horse ready," Gideon said, "and a pack mule for your things. If you're ready to head up now, we can make it before dark." "I'm ready." Eleanor picked up her bag, but Gideon took it from her before she could protest. "I've got it." "I can carry my own." "I know you can. I'm carrying it anyway." They stared at each other for a moment, testing boundaries. Then Eleanor shrugged. "Fine, but I'm carrying something. Give me whatever else needs hauling." Gideon handed her a lighter pack with supplies from Morrison's store, and they walked to where he'd tied the horses. The crowd watched them go, and Gideon heard Mrs. Abernathy whisper something to Morrison that he couldn't quite make out. He helped Eleanor mount. She swung up with easy competence, clearly comfortable around horses, and they set off up the trail without ceremony. The sounds of the settlement faded behind them, replaced by wind in the pines and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on packed earth. They rode in silence for the first mile. Gideon kept stealing glances at Eleanor, trying to reconcile the woman from the letters with the physical reality beside him. She sat her horse well, back straight, eyes taking in everything around them with keen interest. "You're staring," Eleanor said without looking at him. "Sorry. Don't apologize. I'm staring too." I'm just better at hiding it. She turned to face him directly. You're bigger than I expected. The photograph didn't capture the scale. Does that bother you? Should it? It has before. Eleanor considered this, her eyes traveling over his frame with clinical assessment. I don't scare easily, and I grew up with 4 brothers, all of them over 6 feet. Size doesn't intimidate me. She paused. The scar is new information, though. Your letters mentioned a grizzly, but didn't mention it rearranged your face. Gideon's hand moved unconsciously to the scar running down his cheek. If that's a problem... Did I say it was a problem? Eleanor's voice was sharp. I said it was new information. There's a difference. Stop waiting for me to run, Gideon. If I was going to run, I wouldn't have gotten on the damn train in the first place. The trail narrowed as they climbed, forcing them to ride single file. Gideon led the way, hyper-aware of Eleanor behind him, trying to see the familiar path through her eyes. The forest here was thick, old-growth pine that blocked out most of the sunlight. In another mile, it would open up to views of the valley below, but for now, they were enclosed in green shadow. Tell me about the cabin, Eleanor said from behind him. The real version, not the letters version. What's the difference? In letters, people lie without meaning to. They emphasize the good parts and downplay the hard parts. I want to know what I'm walking into. Gideon thought about this as they navigated a steep section of trail. It's one room, 20 by 16, with a sleeping loft. There's a root cellar for storage and a small shed for equipment. I built it all myself 7 years ago, so the craftsmanship is good but not fancy. It's tight against the weather, warm in winter, cool in summer. There's a creek about 50 yards away for water. Furniture? Table, 2 chairs, my bed in the loft, a wood stove for cooking and heat, shelves for supplies, a bench for cleaning game. I built a washstand this spring. Neighbors? None. Closest cabin is 12 miles east, and those folks only come up in summer. In winter, we'd be completely alone. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. And the 5 women who left? What exactly broke them? Gideon had known this question was coming, but still didn't have a good answer. Different things for different women. Martha never made it past town, so I don't know what would have broken her. Caroline lasted 2 days and said it was the trees. Too many of them, too close, made her feel trapped. Ruth made it 4 days before she started having nightmares about being buried alive. Sarah seemed fine until a storm trapped us inside for almost a week, and something about that proximity without escape terrified her. And the 5th woman? Never met me. Took one look from a distance and changed her mind. Her loss. The casual certainty in Eleanor's voice made Gideon turn in his saddle. She met his eyes without flinching. I mean it, she said. Any woman who judges a man based on appearance before ever speaking to him isn't worth your time. You're better off without her. You haven't spent a week trapped in close quarters with me yet. No, but I've spent my entire life trapped in close quarters with myself, which is arguably worse. Eleanor's smile was wry. I know what isolation does to a person, Gideon. I've lived in the middle of a town and felt more alone than you probably do up here. At least your solitude is honest. The trail opened up suddenly, emerging from the forest onto a rocky outcrop that overlooked the entire valley. The settlement was a tiny cluster of buildings far below, smoke rising from chimneys and thin columns. Beyond that, the valley spread out in shades of green and gold, bounded by mountain ranges that stretched to the horizon. Eleanor pulled her horse to a stop beside Gideon's and stared at the view without speaking. A full minute passed in silence. Well? Gideon finally asked. It's not flat. No. And it's not Kansas. Definitely not Kansas. Eleanor took a deep breath, and something in her posture shifted, some tension Gideon hadn't even noticed releasing. Good, because I hated Kansas. They continued up the trail, and Gideon found himself relaxing for the first time since Eleanor had stepped off that stage. She hadn't run, hadn't shown fear or disappointment or any of the reactions he'd learned to expect. She'd just accepted it, accepted him. Maybe that would change when they reached the cabin. Maybe the reality of the small space and the isolation would hit her the way it had hit the others. But for now, for this moment, it felt like maybe this time could be different. The cabin came into view around a bend in the trail, solid log walls, stone chimney, the small porch Gideon had rebuilt last month. Smoke rose from the chimney where he'd left the fire banked, and the afternoon sun hit the windows at an angle that made them glow like amber. Eleanor studied it in silence as they approached, her expression unreadable. Gideon dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post he'd installed last week. "It's not much. Stop." Eleanor swung down from her horse with easy grace. "Stop apologizing for what you have. It's a good cabin, solid construction, good location, clearly well maintained. I've seen far worse." She walked up onto the porch and tested the boards with her weight, then ran her hand along the doorframe checking the fit. "You built this yourself?" "Every board." "How long did it take?" 6 months. Would have been faster, but I was working alone and winter came early that year. Eleanor pushed open the door. Gideon had left it unlocked and stepped inside. Gideon followed, suddenly seeing the space through her eyes and finding it wanting. The cabin was clean and organized, but it was also stark, functional, a place for survival, not living. Eleanor set down her pack and did a slow turn, taking in everything. The wood stove with its neat stack of kindling, the table with 2 unmatched chairs, the shelves lined with supplies in careful rows, the ladder leading to the sleeping loft, the curtains he'd sewn with his clumsy hands. She walked to the window and looked out at the view, more mountains, the creek glinting in the afternoon sun, wildflowers scattered across the clearing. "Where do you want me to sleep?" she finally asked. Gideon had agonized over this question for weeks. "Loft is mine, but I can move down here if you'd prefer privacy. Or I can sleep in the shed if—" "The loft is fine. I'll take the main room." Eleanor turned to face him. "We need to establish some rules if we're going to make this work." "All right. First, I need my own space. Not much, but something that's mine. A corner, a chest for my things, somewhere I can retreat to when I need to be alone. I can build you a privacy screen. Corner by the window has good light." "Good. Second, I need work. Real work. Not made-up tasks to keep me busy. If I'm going to live here, I need to contribute. What needs doing?" Gideon thought about the endless list of tasks he'd been putting off. "Garden needs expanding. Food storage needs reorganizing. I've been meaning to build a proper smokehouse for years. The shed roof leaks in heavy rain. There's That's enough for a start. I'll make my own list as I see what else needs attention." Eleanor pulled off her traveling hat and set it on the table. Her hair had come loose from its pins during the ride, dark strands framing her face. "Third rule, honesty. If something bothers you, say it. If you need space, say it. If this isn't working, say it before we waste months pretending. Same goes for you." "Agreed." Eleanor looked around the cabin again, then back at Gideon. "I'm going to walk down to the creek and wash the dust off. When I come back, we're going to eat dinner, and you're going to tell me the truth about what you expect from this arrangement." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been dancing around the real question since I arrived. You want to know if I can handle this, if I'll last longer than the others, if I'm going to break when the first hard thing happens." Eleanor's voice was matter of fact. "So we're going to address it directly. I'll tell you my concerns, you'll tell me yours, and we'll figure out if this has any chance of working before we waste each other's time." She walked out before Gideon could respond, leaving him alone in the cabin with his racing thoughts. He heard her footsteps on the porch, then fading as she headed toward the creek. Gideon sat down at the table and put his head in his hands. Eleanor had been on the mountain less than 2 hours, and she'd already upended every assumption he'd made. She wasn't waiting for permission or approval. She wasn't tiptoeing around his feelings or pretending things were easier than they were. She was just herself. Blunt, direct, completely unafraid. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating thing Gideon had experienced in years. He stood and started preparing dinner, falling into the familiar rhythm of work while his mind spun. By the time Eleanor returned, he had venison steaks frying in the pan, potatoes roasting on the stove, and coffee brewing. Eleanor had washed and changed into a simpler dress, her hair pulled back in a practical braid. She looked around the cabin, now filled with cooking smells, and nodded approval. "You can cook." "I can survive. There's a difference." "We'll see." Eleanor sat at the table without being invited and watched him work. "What do you normally do in the evenings?" "Depends on the season. Winter, I work on equipment repair, read if the light's good. Summer, there's usually outside work until dark. Sometimes I carve." "Carve what?" Gideon gestured to a shelf where he kept a few pieces, A bear, an eagle, a chess set he'd never finished. Whatever comes to mind. Eleanor stood and examined the carvings, picking up each piece carefully. These are good, really good. You ever sell them? No. Why not? Never thought about it. Well, think about it. These would fetch good money in town. She set down the eagle and turned back to him. Do you have books? A few, mostly practical stuff, trapping guides, animal behavior, plant identification, some novels I've read too many times. I brought books, 3 novels and a collection of essays. We can trade. They ate dinner at the small table, and Gideon was struck by how normal it felt. How easy. There was no awkward small talk, no desperate attempts to fill silence. Eleanor asked questions about the property, and he answered them. She told him about her journey west, and he listened. They cleared plates together without discussion, moving around each other in the small space with surprising ease. When everything was cleaned and put away, Eleanor poured herself a cup of coffee and sat back down at the table. All right, she said. Truth time. What are you most afraid of about this arrangement? Gideon sat across from her, cradling his own coffee. That you'll pretend it's fine until you can't pretend anymore, and then you'll leave without warning like Sarah did. Fair, what else? That the isolation will break you the way it broke Ruth, that you'll start to hate this place and resent me for bringing you here. Eleanor nodded slowly. Anything else? Gideon hesitated, then forced himself to say it. That I'll start to care about you and you'll realize I'm exactly what those other women saw, too rough, too broken, too much to love. The words hung in the air between them. Eleanor took a long drink of coffee before responding. Here's what I'm afraid of, she said. I'm afraid you'll treat me like I'm fragile because I'm a woman, that you'll give me easy tasks and tell me not to worry about the hard things. I'm afraid you'll expect me to make this place softer or more civilized, when what you really need is someone who can help you survive it. She paused. And I'm afraid I'll fail at this the way I've failed at everything else, and you'll be kind about it, which will somehow be worse than if you were cruel. Gideon looked at her across the table. This tall, strong, unflinching woman who traveled across half a country to take a chance on a life that had already defeated 5 other people. I won't treat you like you're fragile, he said, and I don't want this place softer. I like it rough. Good. Eleanor's smile was quick and genuine. Then we might actually make this work. They talked until long after dark, the conversation flowing easier than Gideon had thought possible. Eleanor asked about his daily routine, and he walked her through it, checking traps, hunting, maintaining equipment, the seasonal rhythms that governed life on the mountain. She told him about her work in Lawrence, the peculiar personalities of her customers, the Tuesday card games with her unmarriageable friends. When Eleanor finally announced she was tired and climbed into the bed Gideon had prepared in the corner, he retreated to the loft and lay awake, listening to her breathing in the darkness below. For the first time in 8 months, the cabin didn't feel empty. He didn't let himself hope, not yet, but he let himself imagine what it might feel like if this actually worked. Morning arrived cold and clear. Gideon woke to the smell of coffee and came down from the loft to find Eleanor already dressed, standing at the stove with his coffee pot. You're up early, he said. Old habits. In Kansas, I was always the first one at the shop. She poured him a cup without asking. I looked at your garden. It's a disaster. Gideon took the coffee, unsure if he should be offended. It produces a fraction of what it could. The spacing is wrong, half the plants are competing for resources, and you've got vegetables planted that take too long to mature at this elevation. Eleanor handed him the cup. I'm redesigning it today. That's a full day's work. Good thing I'm here then. Eleanor pulled on the coat she'd brought, too light for Montana winters, but adequate for summer mornings. Show me where you keep your tools. They spent the day in the garden, Eleanor directing the work with the confidence of someone who'd been planning this since she arrived. She had Gideon tear out half of what he'd planted and rearrange the rest according to principles of companion planting and elevation gardening that he'd never considered. Potatoes here, where they'll get afternoon shade. Beans with the corn so they can climb the stalks. Root vegetables in the deeper soil by the creek. Eleanor worked beside him, her hands just as dirty as his, her strength evident in how she turned the heavy soil. You've been fighting this mountain instead of working with it. I've kept myself fed. Fed isn't the same as thriving. Eleanor straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead. You asked me in your letters what I wanted. I want to thrive, Gideon, not just survive. They worked until the sun was high overhead, then took a break by the creek. Eleanor washed her hands in the cold water and sat on a flat rock surveying their progress. This is good land, she said. You could support a family here if you managed it better. Never needed to support a family. No, but you wanted to. Eleanor looked at him directly. That's why you kept trying with those women. You weren't just lonely. You wanted to build something bigger than yourself. Gideon didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Eleanor had seen through him in a way no one else ever had. They finished the garden as the sun was setting, both of them exhausted and filthy. Eleanor looked at the reorganized plot with satisfaction. Better. Not perfect, but better. We'll plant the rest tomorrow. That night over dinner, Eleanor asked about winter. How bad does it get? Bad. Snow from October to May, sometimes June. There have been winters where I didn't see another person for 4 months straight. The trail down becomes impassable. If something goes wrong, you handle it yourself or you die. How much food do you store? Enough for 6 months, usually. I hunt through winter when I can, trap for pelts to sell in spring. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. If I stay through winter, we'll need to store for 2 people. If you stay? When? Eleanor's correction was firm. I didn't come here for 3 months, Gideon. I came here to find out if this could be permanent. So stop hedging and start planning like I'm staying. Something in Gideon's chest loosened at those words. All right, when you stay. The days fell into a rhythm that surprised both of them with its ease. Eleanor rose early and attacked the cabin's inefficiencies with systematic determination. She reorganized the storage so supplies were easier to access, relocated the woodpile to a spot that was more convenient but still dry, started cataloging what they'd need for winter and making lists of improvements. Gideon found himself enjoying the company more than he'd expected. Eleanor wasn't quiet, but she wasn't demanding of attention either. She could work in companionable silence for hours, then suddenly ask a question that led to long conversations. She had opinions on everything, politics, literature, the best way to cure venison, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. You're doing that wrong, she'd say, watching him prepare animal hides. I've been doing it this way for 20 years. Doesn't mean it's right. Here, let me show you. And damn if her way wasn't actually better. 2 weeks after her arrival, Eleanor announced she was rebuilding the shed. It's fine, Gideon started. It's a disaster. The roof leaks, the floor is rotting, and you've got equipment worth good money sitting in there rusting because you can't be bothered to maintain it properly. Eleanor was already hauling boards from his lumber stack. We're fixing it. They spent 3 days on the shed, working side by side in the July heat. Eleanor proved to be a capable carpenter. Her measurements precise, her hammer swings efficient. She didn't ask for help with heavy lifting, but didn't refuse it when Gideon offered. On the evening of the 3rd day, they stood back and surveyed their work. The shed had a new roof, reinforced walls, and a raised floor that would keep equipment dry. Better, Eleanor said. You say that a lot. Because a lot of things here need to be better. But she was smiling when she said it. They were walking back to the cabin when Eleanor suddenly stopped, her hand shooting out to grip Gideon's arm. What is that? Gideon followed her gaze to where a massive brown shape was moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing. His hand moved to the rifle he'd started carrying whenever they worked outside. Grizzly, probably a young male, judging by the size. The bear emerged fully into view, easily 7 feet tall and 500 pounds of muscle. It hadn't noticed them yet, focused on digging in the soft earth near the tree line. Eleanor's grip on Gideon's arm tightened, but her voice stayed steady. Is it dangerous? Depends. If we're between it and food or cubs, yes. Otherwise, usually not. Gideon raised his voice slightly. Hey, bear! The grizzly's head snapped up. It looked directly at them, and Gideon felt Eleanor stiffen beside him. Don't run, he said quietly. Just back toward the cabin slowly. They retreated across the clearing, keeping their eyes on the bear. It watched them for a long moment, then went back to its digging, apparently deciding they weren't worth the trouble. Once they were safely inside the cabin with the door barred, Eleanor sat down at the table. That happens often? Once or twice a month in summer, they usually avoid people, but you can't predict them. Eleanor nodded slowly, processing this. Ruth would have been terrified. Sarah would have insisted they leave immediately. Caroline would have made it another excuse to go back to civilization. "Guess we'll need to be more careful about food storage," Eleanor finally said. That was all. No panic, no demands, just practical acceptance that grizzlies were now part of her reality. Gideon sat down across from her. "You're not afraid. I'm terrified. But being afraid doesn't change the fact that this is where I am." Eleanor met his eyes. "You think I don't know how this looks? A woman my age, unmarried, with no other prospects, latching onto the first man desperate enough to take her? I know exactly what people in town are thinking." "I don't care what they think." "Neither do I. But I care about proving them wrong." Eleanor leaned forward. "I didn't come here because I had nowhere else to go. I came here because I chose to, because I'm done living a small life in a small place pretending to be smaller than I am. Whatever happens with us, that decision was mine, and I'm not running from a damn bear after I've come this far." In that moment, Gideon realized he wasn't just attracted to Eleanor. He respected her in a way he'd never respected anyone. She wasn't trying to be brave or strong or capable. She simply was those things, without apology or performance. "We should get married," he heard himself say. Eleanor blinked. "What?" "Not right now, but soon. Before winter." Gideon felt the words tumbling out, unstoppable now that they'd started. "I know we said we'd wait until fall, but I already know. You're not going to run. You're not going to break. You're going to stay because you're too damn stubborn to let this place beat you." "That's your proposal? You're too stubborn to leave?" "No, my proposal is this. I think we could build something good here. Not perfect, but honest. A life that fits who we actually are instead of who we're supposed to be. And I'd rather start building it now than waste more time pretending we're still deciding." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "Ask me properly," she finally said. Gideon stood and circled the table until he was standing directly in front of her. Eleanor turned in her chair to face him, and he dropped to one knee on the rough cabin floor. "Eleanor Pike, will you marry me?" "Yes." No hesitation, no conditions, just that single word delivered with absolute certainty. Gideon rose and Eleanor stood to meet him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he pulled her into his arms. She fit against him perfectly, tall enough that he didn't have to stoop, strong enough that he didn't have to worry about hurting her. "We're going to have to go to town," Eleanor said against his shoulder. "Make it official. Tomorrow. People will talk. Let them." Eleanor pulled back enough to look at his face. "You sure about this? No more time to reconsider?" "I've spent 7 years reconsidering. I'm done." Gideon touched her face, tracing the line of her jaw with careful fingers. "Are you sure? Because there's still time for you to change your mind." "I'm not changing my mind." Eleanor's smile was fierce and bright. "I'm staying, Gideon. Get used to it." They rode down to Morrison's post the next morning, arriving before the settlement was fully awake. Morrison took one look at them standing together on his porch and smiled. "I'll be damned. She stayed." "She stayed," Gideon confirmed, "and we need to arrange a wedding." News spread through the small settlement like wildfire. By noon, half the population knew that the mountain hermit was finally getting married. By evening, Mrs. Abernathy had appointed herself wedding coordinator and cornered Eleanor with questions about flowers and music. "We don't need flowers," Eleanor said firmly. "Just a preacher and witnesses." "But dear, every woman wants—" "I'm not every woman." Eleanor's tone was polite but inflexible. "Simple ceremony, soon as possible. That's all we need." They were married 3 days later in Morrison's trading post, with Jack Morrison and his wife as witnesses. The preacher kept the ceremony brief, sensing that neither Gideon nor Eleanor wanted unnecessary sentiment. When he pronounced them married, Eleanor kissed Gideon with the same directness she applied to everything else. No shy hesitation, just clear intention. Morrison insisted on hosting a small celebration afterward, and Gideon endured an hour of well-meaning congratulations and barely concealed curiosity before Eleanor caught his eye and nodded toward the door. They escaped back up the mountain as the sun was setting, riding side by side in comfortable silence. As they crested the ridge above the cabin, Eleanor spoke. "They think this won't last." "Probably." "They think I'll run when winter comes." "Let them think what they want." Eleanor smiled. "That's what I thought you'd say." The cabin looked different when they arrived. Still small, still rough, but now unmistakably theirs. Gideon helped Eleanor down from her horse, and they stood together in the clearing, looking at the solid log structure that would be their home. "You ready for this?" Gideon asked. Eleanor took his hand, her grip firm and sure. "I've been ready my whole life." They walked inside together, closing the door on the watching world outside, and began the work of building a life big enough to hold them both. The first argument came 2 weeks after the wedding, on a brutally hot August afternoon when tempers were already running short. Gideon had been checking the northern fence line when he returned to find Eleanor halfway up a ladder, attempting to repair a section of the cabin's roof that he'd been planning to fix himself come fall. "What the hell are you doing?" he called out, dropping his pack. Eleanor didn't look down. "What does it look like?" "This section's been letting in water. I found 3 buckets in the loft catching drips." "Get down from there." "I'm almost finished." "Eleanor, get down, now." She descended the ladder slowly, hammer still in hand, and turned to face him with her jaw set in a way Gideon was starting to recognize meant trouble. "Don't use that tone with me. Don't climb on my roof without telling me. It's our roof now, or did you forget we're married?" Eleanor's eyes flashed. "And I don't need permission to fix things that need fixing. That's not the point. You could have fallen. I've been climbing ladders since I was 12 years old. I don't need you protecting me from basic carpentry." Gideon felt his own temper rising. "I wasn't protecting you. I was going to do it myself." "When? You've been saying that section needed repair since I got here. Meanwhile, we've got water damage spreading through the loft, and you're too busy with your trap lines to deal with it." Eleanor crossed her arms. "If you want something done around here, you either do it yourself or you let me do it. You don't get to tell me to wait while things fall apart." "I had a plan." "Your plan was to ignore it until winter forced your hand." Eleanor's voice was sharp. "I've seen how you operate, Gideon. You handle the wilderness fine, but maintaining the homestead, you do the minimum to survive and nothing more. Well, I'm not interested in surviving. I told you that. And I told you I'd handle it." "You told me a lot of things?" Eleanor set down the hammer with deliberate force. "You told me you wanted a partner, not someone to take care of. But the first time I try to actually partner with you, you order me off a ladder like I'm a child." The accusation hit harder than Gideon expected. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. She wasn't entirely wrong. He had been putting off the roof repair, and his first instinct had been to protect her, even though she clearly didn't need or want protection. "You're right," he said finally. "I'm sorry." Eleanor's anger seemed to deflate slightly. "What? You're right. I shouldn't have ordered you down, and I should have fixed that roof weeks ago." Gideon gestured at the ladder. "If you want to finish it, go ahead. Just let me spot you in case the ladder shifts." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, clearly trying to decide if he was being sincere or just trying to end the fight. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her because she nodded and picked up her hammer. "Fine, but next time you want to tell me something's too dangerous, remember I spent 3 years working construction on my brother's store addition. I know what I can handle." They finished the roof together in tense silence, Gideon holding the ladder while Eleanor secured the last few shingles. When she finally descended, they stood facing each other in the afternoon heat, both sweaty and frustrated. "This is going to happen again," Eleanor said quietly. "We're going to fight. We're both too stubborn not to." "I know. But we can't let it fester. We can't go silent for days nursing grudges. Not up here." Eleanor wiped sweat from her face. "If we're angry, we say it. We fight it out and we move on. Agreed?" "Agreed." Eleanor held out her hand and they shook on it, formal as a business deal. Then, without warning, she pulled him into a kiss that tasted like sweat and frustration and something that might have been forgiveness. "I'm still mad at you," she said when they broke apart. "I know. But I'm also attracted to you when you admit you're wrong. It's inconvenient." Gideon felt himself smile for the first time since the argument started. "Noted." They went inside and Eleanor made dinner while Gideon cleaned the tools they'd used on the roof. The tension between them had shifted into something else, not quite resolved but acknowledged, worked through instead of buried. That night, lying in the darkness of the loft with Eleanor warm beside him, Gideon thought about the 5 women who'd left. None of them had ever fought with him. They'd been too intimidated or too uncomfortable or too ready to leave at the first sign of conflict. Eleanor wasn't any of those things. She met him head on, expected him to do the same, and didn't run when things got difficult. "You still awake?" Eleanor's voice cut through the darkness. "Yeah, I wasn't trying to prove I don't need you. When I was fixing the roof." Gideon turned toward her, though he could barely make out her shape in the dark. "I know. I just need you to trust that I can handle things, even the hard things, especially the hard things." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Every man I've ever known has either been intimidated by my competence or tried to limit it. I need you to be different." "I'm trying." "I know you are." Eleanor's hand found his in the darkness. "We're both trying. That's more than most people manage." August turned into September and the first hints of autumn began appearing on the mountain. The aspens started turning gold at the higher elevations, and the mornings carried a chill that promised winter wasn't far off. Gideon and Eleanor threw themselves into preparation with shared intensity, working from dawn until long after dark to get everything ready. They expanded the root cellar, digging deeper into the hillside to create more storage space. Eleanor took over the garden completely, harvesting vegetables with ruthless efficiency and organizing their preservation with the precision of a military campaign. Potatoes went into the cellar layered in sand. Carrots and turnips were stored in sawdust. Cabbage was made into sauerkraut in massive crocks Eleanor had ordered from town. "We're going to have more food than we can possibly eat," Gideon observed, watching her work. "That's the point. I want a surplus, not just enough." Eleanor didn't look up from the carrots she was trimming. "If we get snowed in for 6 months, I want to open spring with food to spare, not scraping by on the last of the stores." Gideon helped her haul water from the creek for canning, and they spent 3 long days processing venison into jerky and canned meat. The cabin smelled like vinegar and smoke and cooking vegetables, and at night they collapsed into bed too exhausted for anything but sleep. "You work like you're trying to prove something," Gideon said one evening, watching Eleanor organize the 5th set of shelves she'd built in the storage room. "Maybe I am." Eleanor stepped back to survey her work. "I'm proving I belong here, that this wasn't a mistake." "You don't need to prove that to me." "I'm not proving it to you, I'm proving it to myself." Eleanor turned to face him. "You've been on this mountain for 7 years. You know it can sustain you. I've been here 2 months. Every jar I can, every shelf I build, every task I complete, it's evidence that I can do this, that I can make a life here." Gideon understood that drive better than she knew. He'd spent his first 2 years on the mountain doing the same thing, pushing himself to master skills he'd never needed before, proving to himself that he could survive without civilization. "You're already doing it," he said, "making a life here." Eleanor's smile was quick and genuine. "We're doing it. There's a difference." The first snow came in mid-September, a light dusting that melted by noon but served as a warning. Winter was coming, and it wouldn't wait for them to be ready. Gideon took Eleanor on a tour of his trap lines, showing her the routes he'd walk all winter, the shelters he'd built for bad weather, the landmarks that would remain visible even under heavy snow. "If something happens to me," he said, pointing out a distinctive rock formation, "this marks the path back to the cabin. Follow it downhill and you'll hit the clearing. Nothing's going to happen to you. Maybe not. But you need to know this anyway." Gideon continued walking, Eleanor following close behind. "The nearest cabin is 12 miles that way. Family named Hutchins. They're only here summer months, but their cabin's stocked with emergency supplies. If you need help and can't get to town, that's your backup." Eleanor absorbed this information without comment, but Gideon could see her cataloging every detail, building her own mental map of the mountain. They were heading back toward the cabin when Eleanor suddenly grabbed his arm and pointed. "Is that smoke?" Gideon followed her gaze to the southern ridge, where a thin column of smoke rose into the clear sky. Too much smoke for a campfire, too contained to be a forest fire. "Someone's burning slash," he said. "Clearing land, probably." "I thought you said the nearest cabin was 12 miles away." "It is. This is closer, maybe 8 miles. Must be new." Gideon frowned. He'd grown accustomed to having this section of the mountain to himself. The idea of new neighbors sat uncomfortably. "Should we go introduce ourselves?" Eleanor asked. "No." "Gideon, we'll meet them eventually if they stay through winter. No need to rush it." He started walking again, the subject clearly closed. Eleanor caught up to him quickly. "You don't like people much, do you?" "I like you." That's one person. What about everyone else? Gideon thought about how to answer. I don't dislike people. I just don't need them the way most people seem to. Too much company exhausts me. Always has. Even me? You're different. You don't drain my energy the way crowds do. Gideon glanced at her. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. I'm the same way. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. But we can't avoid all human contact forever. Eventually, we'll need to go to town for supplies, see the neighbors, participate in basic social obligations. I know. And when we do, you need to let me handle the talking. You're terrible at it. Gideon couldn't argue with that assessment. They made their first trip to town in October, riding down with a load of furs Gideon had been accumulating and a list of supplies they'd need to make it through winter. Morrison's trading post was busy with other mountain families doing the same last-minute stocking, and several people stopped to stare when Gideon and Eleanor walked in together. Well, well, Morrison called from behind the counter. The mountain man and his bride. Heard you two got married quick. Quick enough, Gideon said. Eleanor stepped forward before he could say anything else. We need to place a large order, Mr. Morrison. I have a list. She pulled out 3 pages of carefully itemized supplies: flour, sugar, salt, coffee, ammunition, lamp oil, fabric for sewing, thread, needles, and a dozen other items Gideon would never have thought to request. Morrison's eyebrows climbed as he read through the list. This is enough to feed an army. It's enough to feed 2 people through a Montana winter without running short. Eleanor's tone was matter of fact. Can you source everything by the end of the week? Most of it. Some items might take longer. Make a note of what you can't get, and I'll adjust accordingly. Eleanor turned to Gideon. I'm going to check the dry goods section. You handle the ammunition and traps. She walked away before he could respond, leaving Morrison grinning at Gideon from behind the counter. She's got you well trained. She's got me organized, Gideon corrected. There's a difference. He spent the next hour selecting ammunition and examining new trap designs while Eleanor moved through the store with systematic efficiency. Other shoppers gave them a wide berth, and Gideon caught fragments of whispered conversations. Lasted longer than the others. Wonder if she knows what she's gotten into. Winter will tell the tale. Eleanor either didn't hear or didn't care. She completed her shopping with the same focused determination she brought to everything, and by the time they left Morrison's post, their pack mule was loaded with enough supplies to see them through to spring. They were talking about us, Eleanor said as they rode out of town. They always do. Doesn't it bother you? Gideon considered the question. Used to, not anymore. Let them talk. We know the truth of what we're building. Eleanor smiled at that, and they rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence. The new neighbors made themselves known in late October when a man and a teenage boy appeared on the trail leading to Gideon's cabin. Gideon spotted them from the woodshed and felt his shoulders tense automatically. Eleanor emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. We have visitors. I see that. The man raised his hand in greeting as he approached. He was maybe 40, weathered by outdoor work, with a boy of about 15 trailing behind him. Hello there. Name's Thomas Warren. This is my son, Billy. We're your new neighbors to the south. Gideon forced himself to step forward and shake the offered hand. Gideon Voss. My wife, Eleanor. Pleasure to meet you both. Warren's smile was genuine, but his eyes kept drifting to Gideon's scar in a way that made it clear he was fighting not to stare. We just moved up from Colorado, bought the old Henderson property, thought we'd introduce ourselves before winter set in. Henderson died 3 years ago, Gideon said. Cabin's been empty since. So we discovered we've been fixing it up, getting ready for our first winter. Warren looked around at Gideon's property with appreciation. You've got a good setup here. Been here long? 7 years. Eleanor stepped in before the conversation could die in awkward silence. Would you like some coffee? We were just about to have some ourselves. Warren's face brightened. That'd be mighty kind of you, ma'am. They sat on the porch. The cabin was too small for comfortable entertaining, and Eleanor served coffee while Warren talked about his plans for his property. He was a trapper and sometime prospector, he explained, and he'd brought his son up to teach him the trade after the boy's mother had died the previous winter. It's just the 2 of us now, Warren said, his voice roughening slightly. Figured we needed a fresh start somewhere new. Eleanor's expression softened. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, ma'am. It's been hard on Billy especially. Warren glanced at his son, who hadn't spoken a word since arriving. He's still adjusting. The boy looked uncomfortable under the attention, his eyes downcast. Gideon recognized the look, grief mixed with the awkwardness of adolescence and the desperate desire to be anywhere else. How old are you, Billy? Eleanor asked gently. 15, ma'am, the boy mumbled. Do you know how to hunt? Billy looked up, surprised. Some, my pa's been teaching me. Good. Winter's going to demand it. Eleanor stood and walked to the edge of the porch. Gideon, show him the smokehouse. Let him see how we're storing meat. It wasn't a suggestion. Gideon stood and nodded to the boy. Come on. Billy followed him across the clearing, clearly relieved to escape the adults. Gideon showed him the smokehouse Eleanor had insisted they build, explaining the curing process and the amount of meat they'd need to sustain them through winter. Your wife, Billy said hesitantly, she's real direct. Yes. My ma was like that. Scared some people. Gideon glanced at the boy. Your father one of them? No, sir. He loved her for it. Said she was the strongest woman he'd ever known. Billy's voice caught. She got sick so fast. 1 week she was fine, the next, I'm sorry. They stood in silence for a moment, both uncomfortable with the emotion but understanding it nonetheless. Finally, Billy spoke again. You been up here alone all these years? Until recently. Must have been lonely. Sometimes. Gideon looked back at the cabin where Eleanor was still talking with Warren. But lonely's better than being with the wrong people. Billy absorbed this wisdom with the seriousness only teenagers can muster. How'd you know she was the right people? Gideon thought about Eleanor's blunt letters, her fearless arrival, the way she'd rebuilt his life without asking permission. She didn't try to change me, and I didn't try to change her. We just fit. When they returned to the porch, Warren was standing to leave. We should get back before dark. Billy and I still have a lot of work to finish before the first big snow. If you need anything, Eleanor said, you're welcome to come by. We're not much for socializing, but neighbors should look out for each other. Warren's relief was visible. I appreciate that, ma'am. Same goes for you. If you folks need an extra set of hands, just holler. After they left, Gideon turned to Eleanor. You didn't have to invite them to come back. Yes, I did. That man just lost his wife, and he's trying to raise a grieving boy in the wilderness. Common decency requires we help if we can. I don't like having people around. I know. But we're going to be neighbors for however long they stay, and I won't have you being rude to a widower and his son just because you prefer solitude. Eleanor's voice was firm. Besides, Billy's a good kid. He'll need someone to talk to besides his father, especially as winter sets in. And you've appointed yourself that someone? If necessary. Eleanor looked at him directly. You can be as antisocial as you want with everyone else, but those two get kindness, non-negotiable. Gideon recognized that tone. Fine. Good. Eleanor's expression softened. Thank you. The Warrens became semi-regular visitors over the next few weeks, stopping by every week or so with questions about the mountain or requests to borrow tools. Gideon tolerated it with more grace than he expected from himself, largely because Eleanor was right. Billy needed the contact with people who weren't his grieving father, and Thomas Warren was trying desperately to hold his small family together. One evening in early November, Warren arrived alone just as the sun was setting. Sorry to bother you folks so late, he said, clearly agitated. But Billy's run off. He took a rifle and some supplies this morning and hasn't come back. I've been searching all day, but I can't find his trail. Gideon was already moving, grabbing his coat and his own rifle. Which direction did he head? North, toward the high country. He's been talking about proving himself, doing something to make me proud. Warren's voice was strained. He's a good shot, but he doesn't know these mountains yet. If night catches him up there, we'll find him. Gideon looked at Eleanor. Get the emergency supplies ready in case we need to stay out overnight, and keep the fire going. Eleanor was already moving. Be careful. Gideon and Warren headed into the darkening forest, moving fast but carefully. The temperature was dropping and clouds were rolling in from the west, promising snow. Tell me exactly what he said this morning, Gideon said as they walked. Warren's voice was rough. He said he was tired of being useless. that his mother would be ashamed of how weak he'd become since she died. I tried to tell him that wasn't true, but he just grabbed his gear and left. They found Billy's trail after 20 minutes of searching, boot prints heading steadily upward into terrain that would be treacherous in darkness. Gideon followed the tracks with practiced ease, reading the story they told. The boy had been moving with purpose, not panicked, but determined. "He's heading for the ridge overlook," Gideon said, "probably trying to spot elk or deer." "In the dark?" "He's 15. Planning probably wasn't his priority." They climbed steadily for another hour, the trail growing steeper and more dangerous. Finally, Gideon spotted a small fire in a clearing ahead, and relief washed through him. Billy was sitting beside the fire, his rifle across his knees staring into the flames. He looked up as they approached, and shame flooded his young face. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I didn't mean to worry you, Pa. I just wanted—" "I know what you wanted." Warren's voice was gentle, despite his obvious fear. "But you can't go running off into the wilderness without telling anyone where you're going. Not up here, not in winter." "I killed a rabbit." Billy gestured to where a small carcass hung from a tree branch. "I was going to bring it back, show you I could provide." "Son, I never doubted you could provide. That's not what this is about." Gideon stayed quiet, letting father and son work through their moment. But he also built up the fire and started preparing coffee, practical actions that gave the emotional conversation space to breathe. Finally, Billy looked at Gideon. "Did I do something stupid?" "Yes." The blunt honesty seemed to surprise the boy. "But I got a rabbit. And you also went into unfamiliar terrain in late afternoon with a storm coming. You succeeded this time, but success doesn't mean the risk was smart." Gideon poured coffee and handed it to Warren, then Billy. "Your mother dying wasn't your fault, and you don't honor her memory by getting yourself killed trying to prove something that doesn't need proving." Billy's eyes were wet in the firelight. "How do you know what needs proving?" "I don't, but I know that running from grief doesn't work. I've tried." Gideon sat back against a tree. "The mountain will still be here tomorrow. The game will still be here. You don't have to earn your place in one day." They camped there that night rather than risk the descent in darkness, and walked back to the cabin in the cold dawn. Eleanor had coffee ready and a breakfast that could feed 6 people, and she fed both Warrens without comment before sending them home with supplies and a stern instruction to Billy to think before running next time. "That was kind of you," Warren said as he prepared to leave. "Not many would have gone searching for someone else's boy." "Eleanor would have killed me if I hadn't," Gideon said. Warren laughed, the sound tired but genuine. "She's something special, your wife." After they left, Eleanor turned to Gideon with raised eyebrows. "I would have killed you?" "Wouldn't you?" "Probably." Eleanor handed him fresh coffee. "But you went because you wanted to, not because I would have made you." Kid reminded me of myself at that age, angry and lost and trying to prove something to nobody in particular. Eleanor studied his face. "Did you ever prove it?" "No. Eventually I just stopped trying." Gideon took her hand. "Then I met you and realized I didn't need to." The first major storm hit in mid-November, 3 days of heavy snow that buried the mountain under 4 feet of white and reduced the world to the small circle of their cabin. Gideon watched Eleanor carefully during those days, looking for signs of the panic that had broken Ruth, the claustrophobia that had driven Sarah away. Eleanor treated the storm like a minor inconvenience. She organized their supplies, took inventory of everything they had stored, and started a list of improvements they could make come spring. When cabin fever threatened on the 3rd day, she taught Gideon a card game her brothers had played, and they competed with vicious intensity until the storm finally broke. "You're not scared," Gideon observed as they stood on the porch, surveying the transformed landscape. "Of what? Snow?" Eleanor shook her head. "I grew up in Kansas. I've seen blizzards that buried houses and killed livestock. This is just weather." "The other women—" "I'm not the other women." Eleanor's voice was sharp. "Stop comparing me to them. They couldn't handle this life. I can. When are you going to believe that?" Gideon looked at her standing in the doorway of their cabin, strong and certain and completely unafraid of the wilderness that surrounded them. "I believe it now." Winter settled in with serious intent after that storm. The temperature dropped and stayed down, the snow accumulated, and the world contracted to the space they could maintain around their homestead. Gideon ran his trap lines in the brutal cold while Eleanor managed the cabin with fierce efficiency. They fell into a rhythm that felt ancient and inevitable. Work, meals, evenings by the fire, long nights in the loft where body heat was a necessity before it was anything else. They argued about small things and big things, fought with the same intensity they brought to everything, and made peace with the understanding that fighting didn't mean failing. "You're doing it wrong," Eleanor would say, watching him prepare hides. "I've been doing it this way for 20 years. And it's been wrong for 20 years. Here." And she'd show him a better method, and he'd resist out of pride before accepting that she was usually right. Or Gideon would find Eleanor trying to reorganize the trap supplies and stop her. "Those need to stay in that order. I can find things in the dark if they're where I expect them." "Your system makes no sense." "It makes sense to me. Leave it." And she would, grumbling but accepting that some things were his domain. Christmas came and went with minimal ceremony. They marked the day with a better meal than usual and small gifts. Eleanor had sewn Gideon a new shirt. He'd carved her a set of wooden buttons with intricate designs. Simple things, practical things, but given with care. "Next year we'll do better," Eleanor said, examining the buttons by firelight. "Next year? We'll have a proper celebration. Invite the Warrens, maybe. Make it feel like a holiday." Eleanor looked at him. "Unless you want to keep hiding from the world up here." "I'm not hiding." "Aren't you?" But Eleanor's tone was gentle. "It's okay if you are. I was hiding too in my own way. But maybe we've hidden long enough." Gideon thought about that as winter deepened. Was he hiding, or had he simply found a place where he didn't need to perform for anyone's comfort but his own? The answer came in January when a freak warm spell melted enough snow to make the trail to town passable. Gideon suggested they make the trip to restock a few supplies, and Eleanor agreed immediately. Morrison's post was quiet when they arrived, only a handful of customers braving the uncertain weather. But Mrs. Abernathy was there, and she cornered Eleanor while Gideon was examining ammunition. "Mrs. Voss, I haven't seen you since the wedding. How are you managing up there?" "Very well, thank you." "Really? I must admit, we all thought—" Mrs. Abernathy trailed off delicately. "Well, you know what we thought. That I'd run like the others?" Eleanor's voice was cool. "I'm not running, Mrs. Abernathy. I'm building a home." "Of course, dear. It's just that your husband is so... and the mountain is so..." Another delicate pause. "Isolated." Gideon started to move toward them, but Eleanor's voice stopped him. "My husband is strong, capable, and honest. The mountain is beautiful, and the isolation is exactly what we both wanted." Eleanor's tone was pleasant, but her words were steel. "I understand that some women couldn't handle the life we're building, but I'm not some women. I'm exactly where I choose to be." Mrs. Abernathy's face flushed. "I didn't mean to suggest—" "Yes, you did, and now I've answered your concern. Was there anything else you needed to discuss?" Gideon watched his wife dismantle the town gossip with surgical precision, and something warm unfurled in his chest. Eleanor wasn't defending him out of obligation. She was defending their life together because she valued it. When they left Morrison's post an hour later, several people had witnessed Eleanor's declaration. The story would spread, Gideon knew. The mountain man's wife wasn't running. She was staying. She was fighting for what they'd built. "That was bold," he said as they rode out of town. Eleanor shrugged. "I'm tired of people treating our marriage like an experiment that's going to fail. We're not failing, Gideon. We're succeeding in a way they can't understand. They'll never understand. I don't need them to. I just need them to stop expecting me to run." Eleanor looked at him. "I told you I was staying. I meant it." February brought the hardest cold of the winter, temperatures dropping so low that breathing hurt and exposed skin froze in minutes. They stayed close to the cabin, venturing out only for essential tasks, burning through wood at an alarming rate to keep the space livable. On the worst days, they huddled close to the stove and talked about the future. Eleanor wanted to expand the cabin, add a second room before next winter. Gideon wanted to build a proper barn for livestock, maybe goats, maybe a milk cow if they could get one up the mountain. "We could support a family here," Eleanor said one evening, her voice casual. "If we wanted to." Gideon looked at her carefully. "Is that something you want?" "Maybe. Someday." Eleanor met his eyes. We're not spring chickens, either of us. If we're going to have children, we should probably think about it sooner rather than later. The idea terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. A child. A family. Everything he'd wanted with the 5 women who'd left him, finally possible with the 1 woman who'd stayed. We'd need to expand the cabin first, he said. Build that second room. Maybe a third. We'd need to store more food. Children eat constantly. We'd need to plan better for medical emergencies. Getting to town in winter with a sick child, we'd need a lot of things, Eleanor smiled. But we have time to prepare, and we're good at preparing. March arrived with false promises of spring, warm days that melted the snow followed by hard freezes that turned everything to ice. Gideon was checking his traps on one of those treacherous mornings when he slipped on a hidden patch of ice and fell hard, his ankle twisting beneath him with a crack that echoed through the silent forest. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Gideon tried to stand and nearly passed out. His ankle was either badly sprained or broken, and he was 3 miles from the cabin with no way to walk. He managed to splint the ankle using his belt and a tree branch, then began the agonizing process of crawling and hopping back toward home. It took him 4 hours to cover 3 miles, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through his leg. Eleanor found him when he was still half a mile from the cabin. She took one look at his condition, and her face went pale, but her voice stayed steady. How bad? Broken, probably. Maybe just badly sprained. Eleanor got her shoulder under his arm and helped him the rest of the way to the cabin. Once inside, she examined the ankle with careful hands, her face grim. It's broken. I can feel the bones grinding. Eleanor looked up at him. We need to get you to town, to a real doctor. Trail's not passable. That ice yesterday. I'll make it passable. Eleanor was already moving, gathering supplies. I'll ride down, bring back the doctor, or bring back materials to set it properly. You're not losing this foot because we're too stubborn to ask for help. Eleanor, the trail is dangerous. I don't care. Her voice was fierce. You went searching for Billy in a storm because it was necessary. I'm riding to town because this is necessary. Don't argue with me. She was right, and Gideon knew it, but the thought of her navigating that treacherous trail alone made his chest tight with fear. Eleanor saw it in his face. She knelt beside him and took his hands. I can do this. You need to trust that I can do this. I do trust you. You just want to protect me. I know. Eleanor kissed him quickly. But right now, I'm protecting you. Let me. She left within the hour, riding Gideon's steadiest horse with supplies and a determination that would have been frightening if it wasn't so necessary. Gideon spent the next 6 hours in agony, physical pain from his ankle, emotional pain from imagining every possible disaster that could befall Eleanor on that dangerous trail. She returned just after dark, the doctor riding behind her on a second horse she'd somehow acquired. Your wife is terrifying, the doctor said, climbing down stiffly. She threatened to drag me up this mountain by my ears if I refused to come. I offered him triple his usual fee first, Eleanor said calmly. The threats only came after he tried to refuse. The doctor set Gideon's ankle with practiced efficiency, splinting it properly and leaving instructions for care. Eleanor paid him generously and rode back down with him to return the borrowed horse, arriving back at the cabin near midnight, exhausted but triumphant. Don't ever do that again, Gideon said when she crawled into bed beside him. Break your ankle or save your life. Scare me like that. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. You scared me too. When I found you crawling through the snow, covered in ice, your face gray with pain, I've never been that frightened in my life. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, just heal. Eleanor rested her head carefully on his shoulder. We take care of each other now. That's what this is. Gideon's ankle took weeks to heal properly, forcing them into new rhythms. Eleanor took over the trap lines, running them with the same systematic efficiency she brought to everything. She wasn't as experienced as Gideon, but she learned fast, and by the time April arrived, she could read animal signs and reset traps with confident competence. You're better at this than I expected, Gideon admitted, watching her skin a beaver with quick, clean cuts. I'm better at most things than people expect, Eleanor grinned. When are you going to stop being surprised by that? Spring finally broke in late April, the snow melting in earnest and the world coming alive again. Gideon's ankle was still weak but functional, and together they began the work of spring, clearing the garden, repairing winter damage, planning the improvements they'd discussed through the long, cold months. Thomas Warren and Billy visited in early May, both looking healthier than they had in the fall. They'd survived their first mountain winter, and the accomplishment showed in the way they carried themselves. "We wanted to thank you folks," Warren said, "for everything you did for us. Don't think we would have made it through without your help." "You would have managed," Eleanor said, "but I'm glad we could help." Billy had grown taller over the winter, his adolescent awkwardness transforming into young man's confidence. He looked at Gideon's splinted ankle with concern. "What happened?" "Learned that ice and steep slopes don't mix well," Gideon said. "Mrs. Voss rode down for the doctor herself," Warren said. "Heard about it in town. Folks are calling her the bravest woman in the territory." Eleanor snorted. "Folks in town need better entertainment." But Gideon saw the pleased flush on her cheeks and knew she valued the recognition, even if she wouldn't admit it. That evening, after the Warrens left, Gideon and Eleanor sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains they'd survived together. The world was green and gold and alive, and the cabin behind them was solid and warm and unmistakably home. "We did it," Eleanor said quietly. "We made it through winter." "We did. And we're still here, still married, still choosing this." Eleanor looked at him. "The town thought I'd run. Your neighbors thought I'd break. Even I thought maybe I'd discover I couldn't handle it." "But you could." "We could," Eleanor corrected. "This only works because we're both in it. Two people who don't fit anywhere else, building something that fits us both." Gideon took her hand, calloused palm against calloused palm. "Think we can do it again next year?" "Next year and every year after." Eleanor's smile was fierce and certain. "This is our place now, Gideon. Our mountain. Nobody's taking that from us." And sitting there on the porch of the cabin they defended against winter and isolation and the world's low expectations, Gideon finally believed it completely. They'd found what they both needed, not just each other, but permission to be exactly who they were. Too loud, too strong, too stubborn, too much for the world below, but exactly right for this wild, honest place. The mountain had rejected everyone else, but it had welcomed them both home. The gossip reached them in June, carried up the mountain by a traveling merchant who stopped at their cabin looking to trade supplies for fresh meat. "Whole territory's talking about you two," the merchant said, accepting the coffee Eleanor offered. He was a round man in his 50s named Chester Dodds, with the easy manner of someone who made his living on conversation as much as commerce. "The mountain man who couldn't keep a wife finally found one who won't leave. Some folks are taking bets on how long it lasts." Eleanor's expression went cold. "Are they now?" "Now, Eleanor," Gideon warned, recognizing that tone. "Don't now Eleanor me." She turned back to Dodds. "What are the odds?" The merchant shifted uncomfortably. "Well, most figure you'll be gone by next spring. Few optimists are saying you might make it 2 years. There's one fellow in Granite Falls who swears you'll last 5 years, but he's considered a fool." "And what do you think, Mr. Dodds?" Eleanor's voice was dangerously pleasant. Dodds looked between them, clearly realizing he'd stepped into something. "Ma'am, I don't presume to know other people's business." "That's a diplomatic answer." Eleanor refilled his coffee with more force than necessary. "Here's what you can tell those gamblers in town. Eleanor Voss isn't going anywhere. Not in 1 year, not in 5, not in 50. This is my home, and these are my mountains, and anyone who wants to bet against that is welcome to lose their money." "Yes, ma'am." Dodds gulped his coffee. "I'll be sure to pass that along." After the merchant left, practically fleeing down the trail, Gideon found Eleanor in the garden, attacking weeds with violent efficiency. "You scared him half to death." "Good. Maybe word will spread and people will stop treating our marriage like a curiosity." Eleanor yanked a stubborn root from the ground. "I'm tired of it, Gideon. Tired of proving myself to people who've already decided I'm going to fail. So stop proving yourself. Stop caring what they think." "Easy for you to say. You've been disappointing people for years. I'm new at it." Eleanor sat back on her heels, dirt smeared across her face. "Every time someone looks at me with pity or skepticism, I want to scream. We've built something good here. Why can't they see that?" Gideon knelt beside her in the dirt. "Because they're not looking. They're too busy watching for us to fail to notice that we're succeeding. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then laughed, a short, frustrated sound. We should start our own betting pool. Wager on how long until the gossips find something else to talk about. My money's on never. Small-town gossip is eternal. Then I guess we'll just have to keep disappointing them. Eleanor leaned against his shoulder. Think we can manage that? I think we've been disappointing people our whole lives. Might as well make a career of it. The conversation with Dodds proved prophetic. Over the following months, a steady stream of curious visitors found excuses to make the trek up to Gideon's cabin. Some came with legitimate business, needing guide work or trading supplies, but most came to gawk at the unlikely couple who'd somehow made it work. Eleanor handled each visitor with brisk efficiency, answering questions without encouraging lingering. Gideon remained his usual taciturn self, speaking only when necessary and making it clear through body language alone that extended visits weren't welcome. But not everyone came out of curiosity. In late July, a well-dressed woman arrived on a fine horse, looking out of place against the rough mountain landscape. She introduced herself as Mrs. Caroline Whitmore from Denver, and she had a business proposal. I represent a collective of women from various Western territories, she explained, sitting primly on the porch while Eleanor served lemonade made from precious lemons she'd acquired in town. We're compiling stories of frontier women who've overcome adversity and made successful lives in challenging circumstances. Your story, Mrs. Voss, has reached us. We'd like to include it in our publication. Eleanor's expression was unreadable. What exactly have you heard about my story? That you came to Montana alone, married a man you'd only corresponded with, and have thrived in extreme isolation where other women failed. Mrs. Whitmore pulled out a small notebook. Our readers would be inspired by your strength and determination. Would they? Eleanor's tone was dry. Or would they read it as an exotic tale about an eccentric woman doing something they'd never consider? Mrs. Whitmore blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. We aim to inspire, Mrs. Voss, not exoticize. And yet you rode all the way up here looking for a story about the strange mountain woman. You didn't come looking for Mrs. Abernathy's story, or the banker's wife's story, or any of the other women in town living perfectly respectable lives. Eleanor set down her lemonade. I appreciate your interest, but I'm not interested in being your inspiration or your curiosity. Mrs. Voss, I assure you, my answer is no. Thank you for the visit. Mrs. Whitmore left with visible disappointment, and Gideon waited until she was out of earshot before speaking. That was blunt. It needed to be. Eleanor watched the woman ride away. She didn't want my story. She wanted a story she'd already written in her head, and I was just supposed to confirm it. The brave woman who conquered the wilderness and the savage mountain man who needed civilizing. Is that what she said? She didn't have to. I could see it in how she looked at you, like you were some kind of project I'd undertaken. Eleanor's jaw was set. I won't let people turn our life into a morality tale about taming wild things. You don't need taming, and I'm not some civilizing force. We're just two people who found each other. Gideon pulled her close, and she softened against him. The world really doesn't know what to do with us, does it? No, and I'm done trying to make them understand. August brought another visitor, this one expected and welcome. Thomas Warren arrived with news that he'd convinced his sister to move west with her 3 children, and they'd be arriving within the month. I know it's asking a lot, Warren said, but Sarah doesn't know anything about mountain living. I was hoping Eleanor might be willing to help her adjust, show her what she needs to know. Eleanor agreed before Gideon could voice his concerns about more people invading their solitude. Of course. Tell her to come by once she's settled. Sarah Warren turned out to be a thin woman in her early 30s, worn down by hardship but determined to build a new life for her children. She arrived at the cabin 2 weeks later, her 3 kids ranging from 5 to 12, all of them wide-eyed at the wilderness surrounding them. Thomas said you could teach me how to survive up here, Sarah said without preamble. I don't want charity and I don't want pity. I just need practical knowledge. Eleanor smiled. Then you've come to the right place. How much do you know about preserving food? They spent the afternoon in the garden and the root cellar, Eleanor walking Sarah through everything she'd learned about mountain living. The children explored the clearing under Gideon's watchful eye, their laughter strange and bright in the usually quiet space. The youngest, a girl named Margaret, approached Gideon cautiously. Are you a giant? No. My brother said you were. He said you fought a bear and won. The bear won. I just survived. Gideon showed her the scar on his face. See? Margaret studied it with the fearless curiosity of children. Does it hurt? Not anymore. Good. She declared this with satisfaction and ran off to tell her brothers about the scar, apparently deciding Gideon was safe despite his size. When Sarah and the children finally left, the cabin felt strangely empty. Eleanor stood in the doorway watching them disappear down the trail. She reminds me of myself, Eleanor said quietly, desperate for a fresh start, determined not to fail. You're helping her. We're helping her. You were good with the children. Gideon shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. They're just kids. Most men your size would terrify them. You didn't. Eleanor looked at him thoughtfully. You'd be a good father. The statement hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. They'd talked about children in abstract terms, but this felt different, more immediate. Is that something you want? Gideon asked carefully. Soon, I mean. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. I'm 39 years old. If we're going to have a family, we can't wait much longer. She turned to face him. But I need to know you want it too. Really want it, not just accepting it, because I do. Gideon thought about the cabin filled with children's laughter, about teaching a son or daughter to read the mountain signs, about building something that would outlast them both. I want it, he said. I've wanted it since before you arrived, but I need to know you're ready. Having a child up here, it's not like having one in town. There's risk. Everything worth doing carries risk. Eleanor took his hand. We'll be careful. We'll plan. And when the time comes, we'll figure it out the way we've figured out everything else. Fall arrived with its usual burst of color, the aspens turning gold, and the air carrying the sharp bite of coming winter. Eleanor threw herself into preparation with even more intensity than the previous year, driven by the knowledge that this winter they might be preparing for more than just themselves. She didn't tell anyone her suspicions at first, not even Gideon. But in late September, when her monthly courses failed to arrive for the second time, she sat him down after dinner with her face carefully composed. I'm pregnant. Gideon's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. You're sure? As sure as I can be without a doctor confirming it. But yes, I'm sure. Eleanor's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach. The baby would come sometime in late April or early May, if I'm calculating right. That's right at spring thaw. Trail might not be passable to get you to town. Gideon's mind was already racing through logistics, potential problems, necessary preparations. I know, that's why we need to plan carefully. Eleanor pulled out a list she'd already started. We'll need to bring the doctor up before the first snow, have him teach us what to expect. We'll need extra medical supplies, more stored food, additional firewood in case I'm bedridden longer than expected. We should tell the Warrens. Sarah's had 3 children. She'll know. No. Eleanor's voice was firm. Not yet. I want to make it through the first few months before we tell anyone. Women lose babies, Gideon, especially older women like me. I don't want to announce it and then have to announce we lost it. The fear in her voice made Gideon's chest tight. He'd been so focused on the joy of the news that he hadn't considered the danger. Eleanor was right. Women died in childbirth, especially isolated women without access to medical care. And at 39, she faced more risks than a younger woman would. We'll be careful, he said, taking her hands. We'll do everything right. There is no everything right with childbirth. Women die doing everything right. Women lose babies despite taking every precaution. Eleanor's eyes were fierce. I'm not afraid of the risk, but I need you to acknowledge it exists. I need you to promise that if something goes wrong, if you have to choose between me and the baby, you choose me. The request felt impossible. Eleanor, promise me. I won't go through this pregnancy terrified that you'll sacrifice me to save a child I might not survive delivering anyway. Her grip on his hands tightened. I need to know you'll choose me. Gideon had never considered he might have to make such a choice. The idea of losing Eleanor was unbearable, but so was the idea of losing their child. But looking at her face, seeing the real fear beneath her practical exterior, he knew there was only one answer. I promise. You come first. Always. Eleanor's relief was visible. She leaned forward and kissed him, and Gideon tasted salt and realized she was crying. "I'm terrified," she whispered against his mouth. "I've never been this scared in my life." "I know, me too." They held each other in the lamplight, two people who'd always prided themselves on fearlessness, finally admitting that some things were worth being afraid of. True to Eleanor's plan, they rode to town in early October and brought the doctor back up the mountain. Dr. Marcus Chen, a cousin of young Tommy Chen who worked for Morrison, examined Eleanor thoroughly and pronounced her healthy and strong. "Your age is a factor," he said bluntly, "but you're in excellent physical condition, which helps. The isolation is my main concern. If there are complications during delivery, you need to be able to get help quickly." "Can you be here when the time comes?" Eleanor asked. Chen considered. "If you send word when labor starts and the trail is passable, yes. But if it comes during a storm or while the pass is snowed in, you'll be on your own. You should prepare for that possibility." He spent the rest of the day teaching them both what to expect, walking them through the stages of labor, potential complications, emergency procedures. Gideon absorbed the information with grim determination, committing every detail to memory. "You're taking this seriously," Chen observed. "Good. Too many mountain men think babies just deliver themselves." "I'm not risking her life on assumptions," Gideon said. Chen nodded approval. "Then you've got a better chance than most. But Mrs. Voss, you need to take it easier than you're accustomed to. No heavy lifting, no climbing ladders, no pushing yourself when you're tired." Eleanor's expression suggested what she thought of that advice, but she nodded. "I'll be careful." After Chen left, Eleanor immediately violated his instructions by hauling water from the creek. Gideon stopped her before she could lift the second bucket. "What did the doctor just say?" "He said no heavy lifting. He didn't say no lifting at all." Eleanor tried to pick up the bucket again, but Gideon moved it out of reach. "I'll handle the water, and the wood, and anything else that requires hauling. Gideon, I'm pregnant, not dying. I can still work." "I know you can. I'm asking you not to. For the baby." He softened his voice. "Please." Eleanor looked like she wanted to argue, but finally she sighed. "Fine, but I'm not spending the next 7 months sitting idle. I'll find other work." She did. Eleanor threw herself into tasks that didn't require heavy lifting, sewing winter clothes for the baby, organizing and reorganizing their supplies, teaching herself to knit from a book she'd ordered from town. She drove Gideon half mad with her restless energy, unable to sit still for more than a few minutes at a time. "You're nesting," Sarah Warren observed when she visited in November. Eleanor had finally told the Warrens about the pregnancy, and Sarah had arrived with advice and hand-me-down baby clothes from her own children. "I'm organizing," Eleanor corrected. "You've reorganized that supply shelf 4 times since I got here. That's nesting." Sarah smiled. "I did the same thing with all 3 of mine." Drove Thomas half crazy. Eleanor looked at the shelf she'd been rearranging and laughed. "I can't help it. Everything feels wrong. Nothing's in the right place." "Nothing will feel right until the baby comes. Then you'll be too exhausted to care about organization." Sarah handed her a bundle of soft blankets. "These are from my youngest. They're worn but clean. Baby won't care if they're fancy." Eleanor accepted the blankets with rare tenderness. "Thank you. Really. We mountain women look out for each other. You helped me learn to survive up here. I'm helping you prepare for this." Sarah glanced toward where Gideon was outside with her boys, showing them how to identify animal tracks in the fresh snow. "He's going to be a good father. You can see it in how he is with children." "I know." Eleanor watched through the window, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "I just hope I'll be a good mother." "You will be. You're strong and practical, and you don't take nonsense from anyone. Those are good qualities for raising children." But privately, Eleanor had doubts. She knew how to survive, how to work, how to fight. She didn't know how to be gentle or patient or any of the things mothers were supposed to be. What if she was too rough for motherhood? Too hard? She shared these fears with Gideon late one night, lying in the darkness of their loft. "What if I'm terrible at it? What if I don't have the right instincts?" "Then we'll figure it out together. Same way we figured out everything else." Gideon's hand found hers in the dark. "You think I know how to be a father? I barely remember my own. We'll both be making it up as we go." That's not reassuring. It's honest. Gideon turned toward her. Our child won't need perfect parents. They'll need parents who show up, who try, who teach them how to survive and thrive in this place. We can do that. Eleanor wanted to believe him, tried to believe him, but the fear lingered, a constant companion through the long winter months. The pregnancy progressed without major complications, though Eleanor's energy flagged as her belly grew. By January, she was visibly pregnant, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose center of gravity had shifted. She hated it. I feel like a cow, she complained, trying and failing to reach her boots. Gideon knelt and helped her with the laces. You look beautiful. You're required to say that. You're the one who got me pregnant. I'm saying it because it's true. And it was. Eleanor's pregnancy had softened some of her sharp edges without diminishing her strength. She glowed with health and determination, even when she was cursing her swollen ankles. The second major storm of the season hit in February, trapping them inside for 5 days. Eleanor handled it better than the previous year, having learned to manage cabin fever through projects and activity. She sewed tiny clothes while Gideon carved a cradle from pine, both of them working in comfortable silence broken by occasional conversation. What should we name it? Eleanor asked one evening. Haven't thought about it. Liar. You've thought about it. I've seen you look at the baby clothes with that expression you get when you're planning something. Gideon smiled slightly. If it's a girl, I like Catherine. It was my mother's name. Catherine Voss. Eleanor tested it. I like it. Strong name. And if it's a boy? You choose. Eleanor considered. James. After my father. He was the only person who never told me I was too much. Catherine or James Voss? Gideon looked at the cradle taking shape in his hands. Our child. The reality of it hit them both in that moment. They were bringing a new life into this harsh, beautiful place. A child who would grow up with mountains for a backyard and wilderness for a playground. A child who would never know the crushing weight of society's expectations because they'd be raised beyond society's reach. They're going to be different, Eleanor said quietly. Growing up here, away from other children, with parents who don't fit normal molds, they'll be an outsider wherever they go. Maybe. Or maybe they'll be exactly who they're meant to be without all the pressure to be something else. Gideon set down his carving. We turned out all right, didn't we? We turned out stubborn and difficult and unmarriageable until we found each other. Exactly. And our child will find their own way, same as we did. March brought the first signs of spring, and Eleanor's pregnancy entered its final stages. She was huge now, uncomfortable and impatient for it to be over. Dr. Chen had visited in late February, timing his trip for before the spring thaw made the trail impassable, and he'd pronounced everything progressing normally. Baby's in the right position. Mrs. Voss is healthy. I'd say you're looking at mid to late April for delivery. Chen had packed his bag with satisfaction. Send Tommy down if labor starts and the trail is clear. Otherwise, you two are on your own. We'll manage, Eleanor had said with more confidence than Gideon felt. The baby came early. Eleanor woke Gideon on April 2nd with a hand on his shoulder and fear in her voice. Something's wrong. I'm having pains and it's too early. Gideon was instantly awake, every sense on high alert. How early? At least 2 weeks, maybe more. And the pains are strong, Gideon. Stronger than practice contraction should be. He lit the lamp with shaking hands and helped Eleanor sit up. Her face was pale, her breathing already labored. Outside, a late spring storm was dumping fresh snow on the mountain. The trail would be impassable. We're doing this alone, Gideon said, forcing his voice to stay calm. Just like we prepared for. You remember what Chen taught us? I remember. Eleanor gripped his hand as another contraction hit. But I'm scared. Me too, but we can do this. Gideon helped her down from the loft, his mind racing through the checklist they'd prepared. Clean linens, boiled water, sharp knives sterilized in flame, everything they might need laid out and ready. The labor lasted 14 hours. Gideon stayed with Eleanor through every contraction, letting her squeeze his hands hard enough to bruise, offering water and encouragement when she could accept it. She was strong, and she was tough, and she was terrified, all of it visible on her face as she fought to bring their child into the world. I can't do this, she gasped during a particularly brutal contraction. Gideon, I can't. Yes, you can. You're the strongest person I know. You've got this. I'm going to die. Women die doing this. You're not dying. I won't let you. Gideon wiped sweat from her face with a cool cloth. Stay with me, Eleanor. Stay with me and fight. Near midnight, the baby finally crowned. Gideon guided their child into the world with hands that shook, despite his desperate attempts at steadiness. The baby, a girl, came out purple and silent, and for one horrible moment, Gideon thought they'd lost her. Then she gasped, coughed, and began to cry. The sound was the most beautiful thing Gideon had ever heard. Eleanor collapsed back against the pillows, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. Gideon cleaned the baby quickly, checking to make sure everything was as it should be. 10 fingers, 10 toes, breathing clear and strong. Then he wrapped her in one of Sarah's worn blankets and placed her in Eleanor's arms. "Catherine," Eleanor whispered, touching their daughter's face with trembling fingers. "We made a Catherine." Gideon had never seen Eleanor cry like this. Great heaving sobs of relief and joy and overwhelming emotion. He held both of them, his wife and his daughter, and felt something shift fundamentally in his understanding of the world. This was what he'd been searching for all those years. Not just a wife, not just a home, but this, family, connection, people who were his in a way that couldn't be taken away or rejected. The storm continued outside, burying the mountain under 2 feet of fresh snow. Inside the cabin, Gideon and Eleanor took turns holding their daughter, marveling at her tiny perfection, too amazed and exhausted to sleep. "We did it," Eleanor said as dawn broke. "We actually did it." "You did it. I just helped." "We did it together." Eleanor's smile was tired but radiant. "Like everything else." 3 days later, when the storm finally cleared and the trail became passable, Thomas Warren rode up to check on them. He took one look at the new baby, and his weathered face split into a huge grin. "Well, I'll be damned. Congratulations." Word spread fast. Within a week, half the Mountain families had made the trip up to see the baby and offer gifts. Sarah Warren brought more clothes. Morrison sent up a crate of supplies marked for the new Voss. Even Mrs. Abernathy from town climbed the trail to deliver a beautifully knitted blanket. "I know we've had our differences," Mrs. Abernathy said stiffly, "but a baby is a blessing. I wanted you to have this." Eleanor accepted the blanket with rare grace. "Thank you. It's beautiful." The visitors eventually stopped coming, and life settled into a new rhythm. Catherine proved to be a demanding baby, crying frequently and sleeping poorly. Eleanor walked the cabin floor at all hours, bouncing the baby and singing the off-key lullabies her own mother had sung. Gideon discovered he had unexpected patience for infant care. He could calm Catherine when Eleanor was too exhausted, walking her around the clearing in the cool spring evenings until she finally settled. He built a sling that allowed him to carry her while he worked, and she seemed to find the rhythm of his movements soothing. "You're a natural," Eleanor observed, watching him repair a fence while Catherine dozed against his chest. "She likes the motion, reminds her of being carried inside you, probably. Or she just knows her father." Eleanor smiled. "The town took bets on how long I'd last. Wonder what they'd think if they could see us now." Gideon looked at their daughter, at the cabin they'd built together, at the garden already starting to show green shoots of their second spring together. "I don't care what they think." "Neither do I." Eleanor walked over and kissed first Catherine's head, then Gideon's cheek. "Let them think whatever they want. We know the truth." The truth was simple. 2 people the world had given up on had found each other and built something that worked. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about their life was perfect, but it was honest and real and entirely their own. Summer arrived in full force, and with it came the realization that they'd need to expand the cabin sooner rather than later. Catherine was already outgrowing her cradle, and Eleanor was adamant about having a separate room for her before next winter. "We can't all sleep in the loft forever. She needs her own space." "I'll start on it next week," Gideon promised. "We'll add a room to the east side, maybe 12 by 12. Give her space to grow." They broke ground on the addition in June, working in shifts while the other watched Catherine. It was slow going with a baby to care for, but by late July the frame was up and the walls were taking shape. Thomas and Billy Warren came up to help with the roof raising, making what would have been a week's work pass in 2 days. Afterward, they all sat on the porch drinking cold cider Eleanor had made, watching Catherine sleep in her sling. "Never thought I'd see the day," Thomas said, shaking his head. "Gideon Voss with a family." Makes two of us, Gideon replied. Town's still talking about you two. Some folks are saying maybe they were wrong about the match. Eleanor snorted. Some folks need to find better ways to spend their time. Can't argue with that. Thomas finished his cider and stood. But for what it's worth, I'm glad you two made it work. Good to see happy endings still happen sometimes. After they left, Eleanor turned to Gideon with raised eyebrows. Happy ending? Is that what this is? Don't know. Haven't reached the ending yet. Good answer. Eleanor took his hand. Let's see how long we can keep the story going. August brought more visitors, some welcome, most tolerated. Word of the mountain couple and their baby had spread beyond just the local territory, and curious travelers occasionally made the trek up to see for themselves. Eleanor handled them all with the same brisk efficiency, allowing brief visits but making it clear their family wasn't a spectacle. Most people respected the boundary. A few didn't and found themselves politely but firmly ushered off the property. You're getting better at running people off, Gideon observed after she'd dispatched a particularly persistent journalist who wanted to write about frontier motherhood. Practice makes perfect, though I shouldn't have to practice running off intruders on our own land. Could put up a sign, private property, trespassers will be shot. Eleanor laughed. Tempting, but then we'd have to shoot someone, and that's more trouble than it's worth. They finished the addition in early September, and Eleanor immediately set about making it into a proper nursery. She sewed curtains from fabric she'd saved, painted the walls with whitewash Gideon mixed, and arranged the furniture they'd built with careful precision. Catherine took her first uncertain steps in that room, holding on to the edge of her crib and wobbling across to where Eleanor knelt with outstretched arms. It was a small thing, a developmental milestone thousands of children reached every day. But watching their daughter walk for the first time, Gideon felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. She's growing up, Eleanor said softly, holding Catherine close. Too fast. That's what they do. I know, but I want to hold on to this time, when she's still small enough to need us completely. Eleanor kissed their daughter's head. Before she grows up and realizes her parents are difficult, antisocial, and nothing like normal people. Then she'll be just like us, and she'll find her own way, same as we did. Fall arrived with its usual brilliance, and the Voss family spent the season preparing for their second winter together. It was easier this time, with established routines and the confidence of having survived it once before. Catherine was walking steadily now, toddling around the cabin and getting into everything. She has your stubbornness, Gideon observed, watching Eleanor try to convince their daughter that eating dirt wasn't advisable. And your complete disregard for danger. She gets that from you. I regard danger plenty. I just don't let it stop me. Exactly my point. Eleanor finally extracted the handful of dirt from Catherine's mouth and set her down safely away from temptation. She's going to be a handful. She's already a handful. But they both loved it, the chaos and noise and constant demands of parenthood. It filled the cabin with life in a way that made the years of silence feel like a different lifetime. The first snow came in late October, right on schedule. They were ready for it, food stored and wood stacked, and the new addition fully winterized. Catherine stood at the window, pressing her small hands against the glass and watching the flakes fall with wide-eyed wonder. Snow, Eleanor told her. That's snow, Catherine. No, Catherine repeated, her vocabulary still limited but growing daily. Gideon scooped her up and brought her outside to experience it properly. Catherine's first reaction was shock at the cold, then delight as she grabbed handfuls of white and laughed at how it melted in her warm palms. This was what they'd built, Gideon thought, watching his daughter discover winter for the first time. Not just a home or a marriage or a family, but a whole world where they could all be exactly who they were without apology or explanation. The mountain had rejected everyone else, but it had given them everything. That second winter passed differently than the first. The cabin that had once echoed with silence now rang with Catherine's laughter and tears, with Eleanor singing off-key while she cooked, with Gideon's low voice reading stories by lamplight. The isolation that had broken other women became their sanctuary, a place where their small family could exist without judgment or expectation. But the outside world had a way of intruding, even on the highest mountains. The trouble started in March, when the spring thaw came early and brought with it a wagon train of settlers heading for the high country. They stopped at Morrison's post to resupply, and one of the families, The Keatings, a loud clan from Ohio with 6 children and opinions about everything, decided they wanted to see the famous mountain hermit and his unlikely wife. They arrived unannounced on a gray afternoon, their wagon groaning up the trail with determination that bordered on aggression. Gideon saw them coming from half a mile away and felt his shoulders tense. "We have visitors," he called to Eleanor. She emerged from the cabin with Catherine on her hip and surveyed the approaching wagon with narrowed eyes. "I don't remember inviting anyone." "You didn't." The Keatings spilled out of their wagon like invading forces. Mr. and Mrs. Keating, their 6 children ranging from teenage to toddler, and Mrs. Keating's sister who'd apparently come west to escape scandal back home. They descended on the cabin with barely contained curiosity. "Mr. Voss, Mrs. Voss!" Mr. Keating was a portly man with a salesman's smile. "We heard about you two in town and simply had to come meet you. What a remarkable story." Eleanor's expression could have frozen the creek. "We're not a story. We're people who value our privacy." Of course. We won't stay long. Just wanted to see how you manage up here, all alone with a baby." Mrs. Keating, a thin woman with sharp eyes, was already cataloging every detail of their property. "Must be terribly hard without proper society." "We manage fine," Gideon said, positioning himself between the Keatings and his family. "And we've got work to do, so if you'll excuse us—" "Oh, but we've come all this way. Surely you can spare a few minutes for Christian hospitality." Mr. Keating's smile never wavered. "My wife made cookies specifically to share with your little one." Catherine, who'd been watching the strangers with suspicious eyes, buried her face in Eleanor's shoulder. She was 15 months old now, old enough to recognize that these people weren't like the few mountain families she knew. "Catherine doesn't take food from strangers," Eleanor said firmly, "and I'm afraid we really are quite busy. Perhaps another time." "Well," Mrs. Keating's smile turned brittle. "I suppose we shouldn't be surprised. We heard you were particular about visitors." "Particular is a polite word for it," Eleanor agreed. "Now, if you'll excuse us." But the Keatings weren't easily discouraged. Mrs. Keating's sister, a woman named Prudence, who looked like she'd been baptized in vinegar, spoke up for the first time. "We also heard your marriage was something of a scandal, that you came here desperate and unmarried and he took advantage." Gideon moved so fast that Prudence stumbled backward. He didn't touch her, didn't raise his voice, but his presence alone was enough to make grown men reconsider their choices. "You're leaving now," he said, his voice deadly calm. "You're getting in that wagon, and you're riding back down this mountain, and you're not coming back. Ever." "Now see here," Mr. Keating started. "I wasn't asking." Gideon looked at each of them in turn. "You came to my property uninvited. You insulted my wife. You're lucky I'm just asking you to leave." The Keatings scrambled back into their wagon with gratifying speed, Prudence muttering about savages and uncivilized behavior. As they rattled back down the trail, Mrs. Keating called back over her shoulder. "The whole territory will hear about this. Your rudeness, your hostility." "Good," Eleanor shouted after them. "Maybe then people will stop treating us like a traveling circus." They watched the wagon disappear, Catherine still clinging to Eleanor's neck. When they were finally alone again, Eleanor let out a long breath. "That's going to cause problems." "Let it." Gideon's jaw was still tight with anger. "I'm done pretending to be civilized for people who can't show us basic respect. They'll spread stories. Make us out to be dangerous recluses. Aren't we?" Gideon looked at her. "We live on a mountain, we avoid people, and we just ran off visitors at near gunpoint. If that's not reclusive, I don't know what is." Eleanor started to laugh, a surprised, genuine sound that made Catherine peek out from her shoulder. "You're right, we're exactly what they think we are. Why are we pretending otherwise?" "No idea. Habit, maybe." "Well, I'm done with it." Eleanor shifted Catherine to her other hip. "From now on, if people want to visit, they can send word first. And if we don't want visitors, we don't have to accept them. Our mountain, our rules." "Our mountain, our rules," Gideon repeated, liking the sound of it. But the Keatings proved as vindictive as they were unwelcome. Within a month, stories had spread throughout the territory about the hostile mountain couple who'd threatened innocent Christian travelers. The tales grew with each retelling. Gideon became a violent brute, Eleanor a harsh woman who'd abandoned civilization entirely. Their cabin a den of antisocial behavior. Morrison rode up in late April to warn them. Folks in town are talking. Some are saying maybe someone should check on your little girl, make sure she's being raised proper. Eleanor's face went white, then red with fury. Check on her? She's our daughter. They have no right. I know that. I'm just telling you what I'm hearing. Morrison looked uncomfortable. There's talk of bringing in territorial authorities, making sure the child's not being neglected or raised in dangerous conditions. Dangerous conditions? Gideon's voice was dangerously quiet. We've kept her safe, healthy, and happy. What more do they want? They want her raised in town, around other children, with proper schooling and church attendance. Morrison held up his hands. I'm not saying I agree. I'm saying this is what they're planning. After Morrison left, Gideon and Eleanor sat at their table in stunned silence. Catherine played on the floor with wooden blocks Gideon had carved, completely unaware that people wanted to take her away from the only home she'd ever known. They can't do that, Eleanor finally said. They can't just take her because we don't live the way they think we should. They can try. Gideon watched his daughter stack blocks with fierce concentration. Territory law is vague about parental rights. If they can convince a judge we're unfit, we're not unfit. We're just different. Different is unfit in their eyes. Eleanor stood abruptly, pacing the cabin like a caged animal. So what do we do? Move? Hide? Pretend to be people we're not so they'll leave us alone? No. Gideon's voice was firm. We fight. We prove they're wrong. How? We bring them up here. Show them Catherine's healthy and happy. Show them we're good parents, even if we're not conventional ones. Eleanor stopped pacing. You want to invite people up here? After we just ran off the Keatings? I want to invite the right people. The doctor. The territorial marshal, if we have to. Anyone with actual authority who can see the truth and shut down these rumors. Gideon looked at her. I won't let them take her, Eleanor. Whatever we have to do, we keep our daughter. The marshal arrived 3 weeks later, accompanied by Dr. Chen and a woman introduced as Mrs. Fletcher, the territorial child welfare advocate. They'd sent word ahead, which was the only reason Gideon didn't meet them at the property line with a rifle. Marshal John Bridger was a weathered man in his 50s, with the careful eyes of someone who'd seen enough of humanity to be skeptical of everything. He shook Gideon's hand firmly and nodded respectfully to Eleanor. Mr. and Mrs. Voss, I appreciate you agreeing to this visit. I know it's intrusive. It's necessary, apparently. Eleanor's voice was tight. Since people seem to think we're abusing our daughter. Nobody's accused you of abuse, ma'am. Just unconventional child rearing. Mrs. Fletcher was a stern woman with kind eyes. We need to ensure Catherine's welfare, that's all. Then ensure it. Eleanor stepped aside. Our home is yours to inspect. They spent the next hour going through every aspect of Catherine's care. Mrs. Fletcher examined the nursery, the food stores, the medical supplies. Dr. Chen gave Catherine a thorough checkup and pronounced her remarkably healthy for a mountain child. Marshal Bridger asked questions about their daily routine, their plans for Catherine's education, their provisions for emergencies. Through it all, Catherine charmed them effortlessly. She showed Mrs. Fletcher her favorite toys, climbed into Dr. Chen's lap to show him a scrape on her knee that needed kissing, and demonstrated for the marshal how high she could count, all the way to 12 before getting distracted by a butterfly. She's clearly well cared for, Dr. Chen said finally. Well-fed, healthy, meeting all her developmental milestones. I see no cause for concern. Mrs. Fletcher was more hesitant. But the isolation. She has no playmates, no other children to socialize with. How will she learn to interact with society? She interacts with the Warrens and their children weekly, Eleanor said. Sarah Warren brings her 3 kids up here regularly, and Catherine plays with them just fine. But no formal schooling, no church attendance, no exposure to culture and civilization. She's 18 months old, Gideon interrupted. Most children her age aren't attending formal schooling either. But when she's older, we'll teach her to read and write and do mathematics, same as any parent would. She doesn't need a schoolhouse to learn. Marshal Bridger had been quiet through most of the inspection, watching and listening. Finally he spoke. Mr. Voss, Mrs. Voss, I'll be straight with you. There are people in town who think you two are dangerous. They point to your size, Mr. Voss, and your scar, and your reputation for violence. They say Mrs. Voss is too mannish, too harsh, not maternal enough. They claim this child is being raised by wolves. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists, but Bridger held up a hand. I'm telling you what they say, not what I believe. What I believe is this. I've seen real neglect. I've seen children beaten, starved, abandoned. This child is none of those things. She's loved, healthy, and happy. Different isn't the same as wrong. Relief flooded through Gideon so powerfully he had to sit down. Mrs. Fletcher still looked uncertain, but she nodded slowly. I'll report that Catherine appears well cared for. But Mrs. Voss, I have to ask, don't you worry about her future? About her ability to find her place in the world when she's been raised so far from it? Eleanor looked at Catherine, who was now showing Marshal Bridger how to stack blocks properly. I worry about a lot of things, but I don't worry about her finding her place in the world. We'll teach her to make her own place, wherever she chooses to be, same as we did. After the officials left, with promises to quash the rumors and shut down any further investigations, Gideon and Eleanor collapsed onto the porch, exhausted by the scrutiny. That was terrifying, Eleanor admitted. They could have taken her. But they didn't. Eleanor took his hand. They saw the truth. That's all we needed. Is it, though? Gideon looked at the mountains surrounding them. Those people in town, they're never going to accept how we live. They're always going to see us as strange, dangerous, wrong. Catherine's going to grow up with that judgment. So did we. And we survived it. Barely. Gideon's voice was rough. I don't want that for her. The constant feeling of not fitting, of being too much or not enough. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then we make sure she knows she's exactly right, exactly as she is. We teach her that the world's opinion doesn't define her worth. And when she's old enough, we let her choose, stay on this mountain or go down to find her own way. But we make sure she knows she always has a home here, a place where she fits completely. It was the right answer, the only answer. But it didn't make the fear go away entirely. Summer arrived, and with it came an unexpected visitor, Elizabeth Morris, the fifth woman who'd run from Gideon before even meeting him. She rode up the trail on a fine horse, well-dressed and clearly prosperous, and asked permission to speak with them both. Gideon's first instinct was to refuse, but Eleanor's curiosity won out. Let's hear what she has to say. Maybe she's come to apologize for wasting your time. Elizabeth wasn't what Gideon remembered. She'd filled out, looked healthier, carried herself with more confidence. She accepted their offer of coffee and sat on the porch, clearly uncomfortable but determined. I owe you an apology, Mr. Voss. A long overdue apology. Elizabeth looked at her hands. I treated you terribly. I agreed to come here, let you believe we might have a future, then ran the moment things got real. That was cowardly. It was honest, Gideon said. You knew you couldn't handle this life. Better to leave than to stay and be miserable. Maybe. But I should have been honest from the beginning. Should have admitted I was looking for adventure, not a real life. Elizabeth glanced at Eleanor. I heard you found someone who could handle it. Someone strong enough for this place. I wanted to see for myself. Eleanor's expression was unreadable. And what do you see? I see someone who's actually brave, not just pretending to be. Someone who stayed when I ran. Elizabeth's smile was sad. I married a banker in Denver. He's kind and successful and completely ordinary. We have a nice house, and I attend nice parties, and I'm bored out of my mind most days. But it's the life I can handle, so I make it work. Why are you telling us this? Gideon asked. Because I've been hearing stories about you two. How you're strange and hostile and raising your daughter in dangerous isolation. And I thought, those stories are being told by people who've never had the courage to choose their own path. People who can't understand that some folks need different things. Elizabeth stood, preparing to leave. I just wanted you to know that not everyone thinks you're wrong. Some of us know we're cowards, and we respect the people who aren't. After she left, Eleanor turned to Gideon with raised eyebrows. Well, that was unexpected. She seemed different. She seemed honest, finally. Eleanor watched Elizabeth ride back down the trail. You think she's happy with her banker and her parties? I think she's as happy as she can be, living the life she's capable of living. Gideon pulled Eleanor close. Same as we are. We're more than happy. We're free. The word resonated. Free. That's what they'd built here. Freedom to be exactly who they were, without apology or modification. Freedom for Catherine to grow up without the crushing weight of other people's expectations. Freedom to define their own version of family and home and success. Fall came and Catherine turned 2, speaking in full sentences now and getting into everything with fearless determination. She was, as Eleanor had predicted, a handful, stubborn, curious, completely unafraid of the wilderness that surrounded them. She tried to pet a porcupine today, Eleanor reported one evening, showing Gideon the quill she'd had to pull from Catherine's hand. I told her not to touch it. She looked me right in the eye and touched it anyway. She gets that from you. She gets that from both of us. We've raised a tiny tyrant. But Eleanor's voice was full of affection. Sarah Warren says she's never seen a child so confident, says most 2-year-olds are timid around new things. Catherine's not most children. No, she's ours. They celebrated Catherine's 2nd birthday with the Warrens, a simple party with cake Eleanor had made, and presents the families had cobbled together from available materials. Billy Warren, now 17 and shooting up like a weed, had carved Catherine a set of animal figures that she immediately claimed as her favorites. You're good with your hands, Eleanor told him. Have you thought about apprenticing with a carpenter or a woodworker? Billy shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. Pa wants me to take over his trap lines eventually. What do you want? The question seemed to startle the boy. I don't know. Nobody's ever asked me that. Well, I'm asking. You're almost grown now. Time to start thinking about what kind of life you want to build. Gideon watched Eleanor counsel the boy and felt something warm in his chest. She was good at this, helping people see possibilities they'd never considered for themselves. She'd done it for him, after all. Shown him that his life could be more than just survival. Winter came hard that year, the worst they'd seen yet. Snow piled up to the cabin's windows and temperatures dropped so low that water froze inside the cabin if they let the fire die down. They were completely cut off from the outside world for 3 solid months, just the 3 of them in their small space. It should have been suffocating. Instead, it was perfect. They fell into rhythms that felt ancient, Gideon maintaining their firewood and checking their stores, Eleanor managing the household and teaching Catherine her letters, all of them together in the evenings telling stories and playing simple games. The isolation that had broken other families made them stronger, more tightly bonded. Catherine thrived in it. She didn't know that other children lived differently, surrounded by playmates in schools and churches. She only knew that her world consisted of 2 adults who loved her completely, in a wilderness that was her kingdom. You think she'll resent us someday? Eleanor asked one night, watching Catherine sleep in her small bed. For raising her so far from everything? Maybe. Probably. Gideon pulled Eleanor close. But I think she'll also thank us for giving her space to be herself, for not forcing her into a mold she doesn't fit. I hope so. I hope we're doing this right. There is no right. There's just what we're doing and trying our best. Spring brought the thaw and the return of contact with the outside world. The first visitor was Morrison, riding up with supplies and news. Town's mostly stopped talking about you folks, he reported. Marshal Bridger made it clear anyone who kept spreading rumors would answer to him. Folks decided their time was better spent on other people's business. Thank God for small favors, Eleanor said. There is one thing, though. Morrison looked uncomfortable. There's a new family moving into the valley, from back east. They've got money, and they're building a big house down near the settlement. Wife is apparently very interested in civilizing the territory, organizing social events, starting a proper school, that sort of thing. Good for her, Eleanor said, as long as she leaves us alone. That's the thing. She's heard about Catherine, wants to offer her a place in the school when it opens, free of charge. Eleanor's expression hardened. Catherine doesn't need her charity. I'm just passing along the message, ma'am. You can tell Mrs. Pemberton yourself when she rides up here. She's planning to visit? She's planning to visit everyone. Considers it her duty to bring culture to the mountains. Morrison's tone suggested what he thought of that duty. Mrs. Pemberton arrived 2 weeks later, riding side saddle on an expensive mare and dressed like she was attending a society function. She was younger than Eleanor expected, maybe 30, and beautiful in a fragile porcelain way that seemed completely unsuited to frontier life. Mrs. Voss, I'm Lydia Pemberton. I've heard so much about you. Her voice was bright and cultured. And you must be Mr. Voss. My, you're imposing, aren't you? Gideon said nothing. Eleanor stepped forward. "What can we do for you, Mrs. Pemberton? Please call me Lydia. We're going to be neighbors after all." She dismounted gracefully and accepted Eleanor's offer of water. "I wanted to discuss your daughter's education. I'm opening a school in the fall, and I'd be delighted to have Catherine attend." "Catherine's 2 years old." "Yes, but it's never too early to start proper socialization, and I understand she's been raised rather informally. The school would help her learn proper behavior, social graces, all the things a young lady needs." Eleanor's smile could have cut glass. "Catherine is being raised just fine, thank you. She doesn't need your school." "But Mrs. Voss, surely you want her to have opportunities, to learn from trained teachers, to make friends with other children, to prepare for life in civilized society." "We're not raising her for civilized society," Gideon interrupted. "We're raising her for whatever life she chooses." Lydia's perfect composure slipped slightly. "But you can't mean to keep her up here forever. What about her future, her prospects?" "Her prospects are none of your concern," Eleanor said flatly. "Thank you for the offer, but Catherine won't be attending your school. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." Lydia left with visible disappointment, but she returned a month later, this time bringing her husband, a banker named Richard, who seemed uncomfortable with the whole expedition. "My wife is quite determined about this school," he explained apologetically. "She thinks every child deserves education." "Our daughter is educated," Eleanor said. "We teach her ourselves. But surely professional instruction is no better than what we can provide. We're both literate, capable of teaching mathematics and history and everything else a child needs. Catherine doesn't require a schoolhouse." Lydia tried a different approach. "But what about socialization? Children need other children." "She has other children. The Warren kids visit regularly. That's sufficient." "It's really not, though." Lydia's voice took on a harder edge. "A child raised in isolation, without proper social structure, will grow up unable to function in normal society." "Good," Eleanor said, "because normal society is exactly what we're trying to avoid." The Pembertons left frustrated, and Eleanor thought that was the end of it, but Lydia proved as persistent as she was misguided. She began writing letters, suggesting educational resources, offering books and materials for Catherine's instruction. When those were politely refused, she started spreading concern about the wild child being raised on the mountain. "She's relentless," Eleanor complained to Sarah Warren during one of their visits. "She cannot accept that we don't want what she's offering." "She means well," Sarah said carefully, "in her own way. Meaning well doesn't give her the right to interfere with our family." But the interference continued. Lydia organized a petition calling for mandatory education for all children in the territory. She gave speeches in town about the importance of civilized upbringing. She positioned herself as Catherine's advocate, the voice of a child who couldn't speak for herself. It came to a head in August when Lydia rode up with a territorial education officer and demanded to test Catherine's development. "This is harassment," Eleanor said, blocking the cabin door. "This is concern for a child's welfare," Lydia countered. "If you have nothing to hide, you'll allow the assessment." Gideon stepped forward, his size making both visitors take an involuntary step back. "You need to leave, now." "We're not leaving until—" "Yes, you are." Marshal Bridger's voice cut through the confrontation. He'd ridden up behind the Pembertons, his face set in hard lines. "Mrs. Pemberton, I warned you about this. The Voss family has been investigated and cleared. You have no legal standing to demand anything. But the child is fine, healthy, happy, and well cared for. Drop this crusade before I charge you with harassment." Lydia left finally, but her parting words lingered. "You're condemning that child to a life of isolation and ignorance. When she grows up unable to function in the real world, it will be on your conscience." After everyone left, Eleanor sat on the porch steps with her head in her hands. Catherine was inside napping, unaware of the battle being fought over her future. "Maybe she's right," Eleanor said quietly. "Maybe we're being selfish, keeping her up here away from everything." "We're being honest, raising her the only way we know how." Gideon sat beside her. "The world wanted to make us smaller, quieter, more acceptable. We refused. We're giving Catherine the same choice. But what if she needs more than we can give her? What if she grows up and hates us for limiting her? Then we'll handle it when it happens. But we can't raise her based on what she might want someday. We raise her based on what we believe is right now. Eleanor looked at the mountains surrounding them, the wilderness that had become their refuge. I just want her to be happy. She is happy. Look at her, Eleanor. She's confident, curious, fearless. She knows she's loved completely. How many children can say that? It was true. Catherine was thriving in ways that had nothing to do with formal education or social graces. She was becoming exactly who she was meant to be, without the weight of expectation crushing her into an acceptable shape. Fall arrived and the Pemberton School opened to much fanfare. 8 children attended the first day, children from the settlement and the nearby homesteads. Lydia made a point of mentioning loudly and often that the Voss child had been invited, but the parents had refused. Let her talk, Gideon said. Words can't hurt us up here. But words had power, even at a distance. Stories spread about the strange mountain family, the wild child being raised without civilization's influence, the parents who'd rejected society's help. Some people viewed it with disgust, others with fascination. A few, the ones who'd never quite fit themselves, viewed it with quiet envy. Winter that year was mild, allowing for more contact with the outside world than usual. The Warrens visited frequently, and Catherine's friendship with their children deepened. She was different from them, more independent, more comfortable in the wilderness, but the differences didn't matter. They played together with easy acceptance, creating games that required neither social graces nor formal education. Your girl's something special, Thomas Warren told Gideon one evening. Billy says she can track animals better than kids twice her age. She pays attention, watches how things move, remembers patterns. It's more than that. She's got instincts, natural understanding of the mountain. Thomas paused. Some folks in town say you're raising her wrong, but I see a child who knows herself, knows her place in the world. That's more than most kids ever get. The validation mattered more than Gideon wanted to admit. He'd spent so many years being told he was wrong, too much, unacceptable. The idea that he and Eleanor might be doing something right, might be giving Catherine something valuable, eased a fear he hadn't fully acknowledged. Spring brought Catherine's 3rd birthday and an unexpected gift. Elizabeth Morris, the woman who'd apologized the previous summer, sent a package containing a beautiful illustrated children's book with a note. For Catherine, may she grow up knowing she can choose her own story. Eleanor read the book to Catherine that night, and their daughter listened with rapt attention, asking questions about the pictures and the words and what everything meant. At 3 years old, she was already starting to read simple words, taught by parents who valued education even if they rejected formal schooling. She's going to be smart, Eleanor observed, watching Catherine trace letters with her finger. Smarter than both of us, probably. Then she'll have choices we never had. And she'll make them on her own terms, just like we taught her. Summer arrived and brought news that the Pembertons were leaving the territory. Richard's bank had collapsed, taking their fortune with it, and they were returning east to family money and the society they'd never really left. Lydia Pemberton stopped by the post before they left, Morrison reported during a supply run. Said to tell you she still thinks you're wrong, but she respects your commitment. Said she hopes your daughter proves her wrong. She will, Eleanor said with certainty. Not to prove anything to Lydia Pemberton, but because she's going to be exactly who she's meant to be. The years began to blur together in the way of happy times. Catherine grew from toddler to child, learning to read and write under Eleanor's patient instruction, learning to hunt and track and survive under Gideon's careful guidance. She was 5, then 6, then 7, and with each year she became more herself, confident, capable, comfortable in her own skin in a way her parents had spent decades learning. She was also lonely sometimes. The Warren children visited less frequently as they got older and took on more responsibilities. Catherine had no schoolmates, no constant companions beyond her parents. Eleanor watched her daughter play alone and worried. "We could move," she said to Gideon one night, "down closer to town. Give her more contact with other children." "Do you want to move?" Eleanor thought about the cabin they'd built together, the mountain that had given them permission to exist. "No, but I'd do it for her." "Let's ask her first." They did, sitting Catherine down at the table and explaining the choice. She could stay on the mountain with them, or they could move to town where she'd have neighbors and friends and access to the school. Catherine listened carefully, her young face serious. At 7 years old, she was already starting to think like the woman she'd become, weighing options, considering consequences. "If we move to town," she said slowly, "will there be mountains there? You can see them from town, but we wouldn't live on them anymore. Will there be quiet? Less quiet. More people, more noise." Catherine thought about this. "I like the quiet. I like the mountains. I like it here." She looked at both her parents. "Is it okay if I don't want to move?" Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "It's more than okay. It's perfect." "But what about friends? Don't you want other children to play with?" Catherine shrugged. "I have Billy and his siblings when they visit, and I have you and Papa. That's enough friends." She said it with such certainty, such complete lack of doubt, that Eleanor realized her daughter wasn't suffering from isolation. She was thriving in it, the same way her parents had, the same way some people just did when they found the space that fit them. 8 years after Eleanor had first climbed that mountain as a desperate woman with nowhere else to go, she stood on the porch of their cabin, expanded twice now to accommodate their growing family, and watched the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and orange. Catherine was in the garden, talking to herself as she worked, telling stories about the plants and the insects, and whatever was happening in her vivid imagination. Gideon was repairing fence line, his movement still strong despite the gray that now dominated his beard. This was what they'd built, not just a home or a family, but a whole world where being different wasn't a flaw that needed correcting. A place where too loud, too strong, too stubborn, too much all became exactly right. The town still talked about them sometimes. The strange mountain family who'd rejected civilization. The child being raised wild. The marriage that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. Let them talk. Let them speculate and judge and disapprove. Up here, 8 miles from their opinions and expectations, none of it mattered. Eleanor thought about the letters she'd written to Gideon all those years ago. The blunt honesty that had started everything. "I'm not a beautiful woman. I'm not graceful or charming or any of the things men typically want. I'm tall and built strong from years of physical work. I have a loud voice and opinions I don't apologize for." She'd written those words as confessions, admitting flaws she'd been told made her unmarriageable. But they weren't flaws. They were just facts about who she was. And Gideon had read them and seen not a broken woman, but a person exactly like himself. Too much for the world below, exactly right for the world they could build together. Gideon joined her on the porch, his work finished for the day. They stood together watching their daughter work in the garden, watching the sun set on another day in their improbable life. "You ever regret it?" Eleanor asked. "Marrying me, staying here, building this life?" "Never. Not once." Gideon took her hand. "You?" "Never." And it was true. There had been hard moments, times when the isolation pressed too close, when worry about Catherine kept her awake, when the weight of the world's judgment felt heavier than she wanted to admit. But regret? Never. Because this life, strange and isolated and completely unconventional as it was, belonged to them in a way that nothing in civilization ever could. They'd built it with their own hands, filled it with their own choices, shaped it to fit exactly who they were. Catherine came running up from the garden, dirt-smeared and grinning. "Mama, the tomatoes are finally ripe. Can we make that sauce you taught me?" "Tomorrow," Eleanor promised. "Tonight, we're having what Papa caught this morning." "Trout again?" Catherine wrinkled her nose but didn't really complain. She'd grown up eating what the mountain provided, and she wouldn't know to expect anything else. They went inside together as darkness fell, lighting lamps and preparing the evening meal. Through the window, the wilderness stretched out in every direction, vast, unforgiving, and perfect. 20 years later, travelers passing through the territory still told stories about the mountain family. The giant trapper who'd finally found a wife tough enough to stay. The strong woman who'd chosen wilderness over civilization. The daughter they'd raised wild and free. Some stories were true. Many were exaggerated. All of them missed the point. The point was simple. Two people who didn't fit anywhere else had found each other and built a space that fit them both. They'd raised a daughter who knew her worth wasn't determined by how well she matched other people's expectations. They'd created a life that worked precisely because they'd stopped trying to make it work for anyone but themselves. Gideon Voss had been rejected by 5 women before Eleanor Pike. Eleanor Pike had been rejected by 3 men before Gideon Voss. The world had looked at them both and said too much, too big, too strong, too stubborn, too loud, too everything. But up on that mountain, surrounded by wilderness and silence and the occasional curious visitor, too much became exactly enough. And that was the only truth that mattered. The cabin stood solid against another winter storm, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin gray line. Inside, a family gathered around their table, warm and safe and completely themselves. The world below had its opinions. The mountain didn't care, and neither did they.